Hello everyone, welcome to Frightening Tales. I know you watch this video to accompany you to sleep, so if you like this video don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Also don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. The Legacy of Blood. When Lila Mercer inherited her grandfather's crumbling Victorian home, the lawyer handed her the keys with a trembling hand. Charles Mercer was a private man, he warned. Some things are better left undisturbed. She should have listened. The locked door. The house smelled of dust and old secrets. Lila found a locked door on the third day, hidden behind a floor-to-ceiling bookcase in the study. The keyhole was oddly shaped, like a jagged tooth. Her grandfather's pocket watch fit perfectly. The room beyond was a time capsule of terror. Walls papered with yellowed news clippings of unsolved crimes spanning 50 years. A map of the neighborhood with red pins at each crime scene. Shoe boxes labeled with dates, each containing victims' personal items. A police scanner from the 1970s, still faintly humming. The pattern emerges. Lila recognized the names. Molly Sims, 1969, the little girl who vanished on her way to school. Robert Chen, 1983, the college student found in the park. Father Callahan, 1997, the priest who disappeared after confession. All unsolved. All within walking distance. All with one disturbing connection: each victim had last been seen talking to a kind old man who offered them candy, or help with groceries, or directions. Her grandfather. The ledger. Beneath the desk, Lila found a leather-bound book. The entries read like a twisted diary. July 12, 1981, the Chen boy resisted. Had to use the special tools. His glasses shattered beautifully. March 3, 1995, the priest smelled my guilt in confession. I gave him absolution in the basement. The final entry. Too old now. The house must finish what I started. She'll understand when she finds the tapes. The basement. The pull chain light revealed. A dentist's chair with heavy leather restraints. Glass jars of teeth arranged by size. A wall of VHS tapes labeled with victim names. The projector flickered to life on its own. The grainy footage showed her grandfather humming as he sharpened tools. The camera panned to reveal the room she was standing in. From a different angle. With someone still sitting in the chair. The newest tape was dated last week. It showed Lila's own house. Her grandfather's corpse propped in his favorite armchair. His lifeless hand pointing to the camera. Then the screen filled with static as a shadow moved toward the lens. Story 2. In 1986, a young nurse named Sherry Rasmussen was murdered in Los Angeles. Police pinned down no suspects, and the case gradually went cold. It took 23 years and revolutionary breakthroughs in forensic science before LAPD detectives could finally assemble the pieces of the puzzle. When they did, they found themselves facing one of the unlikeliest murder suspects in the city's history. It was a burglary gone awry. That's how it looked, at least, to the Los Angeles police detectives who arrived at a gated condo complex in the Van Nuys section of Los Angeles on the evening of February 24, 1986. The body of a 29-year-old nurse and 3-month newlywed, Sherry Rasmussen, had been discovered by her husband, John Ruetten. When Ruetten, an engineer, had come home from work at 5:55 p.m., he'd known instantly that something was wrong. The garage door was open and the silver 2-door BMW he'd bought Rasmussen as an engagement gift was gone. It seemed strange that she would not be home. He knew she had called in sick to work that morning. When Ruetten rushed inside, he found his wife's body in the ransacked living room. Shards from a broken porcelain vase littered the floor. A TV wall unit was partially collapsed. A credenza drawer had been yanked out and its contents, mostly documents, dumped on the floor. Examining the scene, the lead homicide detective, Lyle Meyer, began to piece together what he thought had taken place. Burglars must have entered through the unlocked front door. While one removed electronics from the wall unit, the other went upstairs and was surprised by Rasmussen. Her attire, robe, t-shirt, and panties suggested she had not been expecting visitors. More stories. Women and children sit on dusty rocks with men standing behind, facing distant airport walls and watching a military plane taking off. The betrayal. George Packer. An illustration of the American flag with a white shroud draped over it. Are we doomed? George Packer. Illustration with blue rectangle at top left and red/white vertical stripes, in which two white bars and a cloud of smoke form the shape of the World Trade Center. 9/11 was a warning of what was to come. George Packer. Rasmussen was 6 feet tall and fit, and the ensuing struggle was ferocious. It evidently began in the dining room on the second floor of the townhouse, where shots were fired from a .38 caliber pistol, one of which may have hit Rasmussen. Hearing the shots, the downstairs burglar probably fled, ditching the video components. A blood trail down the stairs and a bloody handprint near the front door suggested Rasmussen had tried to escape or reach the panic button on the alarm panel located there, but her assailant followed. In the living room, Rasmussen had been bitten on her left forearm, perhaps while grappling for the gun, and then struck over the head with the heavy vase, a blow that likely incapacitated her. The assailant had then taken a quilt from across the room, presumably to muffle the gun's report, and fired more shots through it, killing Rasmussen. A housekeeper in the unit next door later said she'd heard a scuffle and a scream, but no gunshots. Imagining the din to be a domestic altercation, she hadn't called the police. In all, Rasmussen had been shot 3 times in the chest, the bullets piercing her heart, lungs, and spine. When it was over, the killer stole the BMW parked in the garage. That most items in the house appeared undisturbed, including Rasmussen's jewelry box, sitting in plain view on her dresser, seemed to Meyer further evidence of a rushed exit. It wasn't until nearly 2 o'clock in the morning that Lloyd Mahoney, a criminalist from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, arrived to examine the body. It was his second homicide of the night. Mahoney began by checking for trace evidence around the victim's body: hair, fibers, anything unusual, but he found nothing of note. Next, he opened a sexual assault kit and collected a series of swabs and slides. When he noticed the bite mark on Rasmussen's arm, Mahoney selected a 6-inch swab housed in a tube with a red rubber stopper. He removed the stopper and carefully swabbed the impression left by the assailant's teeth. He reinserted the swab into the tube, squeezed the stopper shut, and labeled it with his initials and the coroner's case number. He placed the tube inside a 5 by 7-inch LA coroner's physical evidence envelope, on which he wrote Sherry Rasmussen's name, a description of the contents, and where he'd obtained them. Then he sealed it, noting the date and time he had done so. The sun was just coming up over the San Fernando Valley when Mahoney completed his work at the crime scene. He drove directly to the coroner's office, where an evidence custodian booked the swab of the bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's arm into evidence at 10:32 a.m. on February 25, 1986. Transcript of police interview with Stephanie Lazarus, June 5, 2009. Detective Jaramillo: I didn't want to talk about this in the squad room, cause. Stephanie Lazarus: oh, that's okay. Detective Jaramillo: I don't know what people are listening. We've been assigned a case that we've been looking at and reviewing the case. There's some notes to see as far as your name being mentioned. Stephanie Lazarus: oh, okay. Detective Jaramillo: do you know John Ruetan? Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, Sherry's parents, arrived in Los Angeles from Arizona the day after the murder. Nels immediately sought out Meyer, the homicide detective, who informed him that the police were looking for one or more burglars in connection with the killing. He also told Nels they had ruled out John Ruetan as a suspect. Nels mentioned that his daughter had complained 1 or 2 months earlier about an ex-girlfriend of her husband's who had shown up at Sherry's hospital one day and confronted her. Nels didn't know the ex-girlfriend's name, but he knew she was a Los Angeles police officer. In Nels's mind, she was a prime suspect. Meyer made a note of the ex-girlfriend in the case file but apparently never followed up. The stolen BMW was found abandoned nearby about a week later, but it offered up no further clues. 2 months after the murder, a pair of men attempted a burglary a few blocks from Sherry's condo. When Meyer learned that one of them had brandished a gun, these unidentified burglars became the focus of his homicide investigation. But the suspects remained elusive, and months passed without further leads. In late October, the Los Angeles Times ran a story on the now 8-month-old case, reporting that the Rasmussens were offering a $10,000 reward for any information regarding the suspects in their daughter's murder, whom Meyer described in the article as 2 Latino men between 5 feet 4 inches and 5 feet 6 inches tall. In 1986, the year Rasmussen was killed, Los Angeles recorded 831 murders, a figure nearly triple what it is today. By the end of the year, LAPD homicide detectives had solved 538 of those murders, a clearance rate of 65%. Of them, 463 were cleared by arrest and 75 cleared other, a catch-all designation for cases in which there is sufficient information to support the arrest of a suspect but, for reasons outside police control, no arrest can be made, for instance, when the suspect is dead or cannot be extradited to Los Angeles. LAPD homicide detectives track their clearance rate the way pro athletes track their season stats. It's the number by which their performance is judged, both within the unit and up the chain of command. The clearance rates reported at the end of each calendar year stand in perpetuity, they cannot be corrected through later arrests. If a homicide occurs in late December but an arrest is made in January, credit for the clearance is taken in the year of the arrest, not the year of the murder. One corollary of this quirk is that a division can raise its current year clearance rate by solving old cases as well as fresh ones. In 2009, for instance, the LAPD's Olympic Division recorded 7 new murders, but its detectives were able to solve a total of 15, giving the unit an eye-popping clearance rate of 214%. At midnight on December 31st, when the LAPD closed the books on its 1986 homicide statistics, Sherry Rasmussen's murder was indelibly recorded as one of 293 unsolved cases. Detective Jaramillo, was there ever any relationship or anything that developed between you and him? Stephanie Lazarus, yeah, I mean, we dated. Detective Jaramillo, uh-huh. Stephanie Lazarus, you know, I mean, is it what's this all about? Detective Jaramillo, it's relating to his wife. Few people could have predicted in early 1986 that the science of police work was about to take an epical leap forward. Not since 1901, when Scotland Yard validated fingerprinting for the purpose of criminal identification, had detectives' power to solve crimes been so profoundly transformed. 7 months after Sherry Rasmussen's death, half a world away from Los Angeles, DNA was used in a criminal investigation for the first time. 2 15-year-old girls from neighboring villages outside Leicester, in the English Midlands, had been killed, one of them that summer and one 3 years earlier. Both victims had been raped and strangled, their bodies left beside out-of-the-way footpaths. The inescapable conclusion for both police and terrified residents was that a serial predator was hiding among the local population. As Joseph Wambaugh, the LAPD detective turned crime writer, recounted masterfully in his 1989 book, The Blooding, an unprecedented force of 200 police officers was assembled to hunt for the murderer. Suspicion quickly fell upon a 17-year-old boy who seemed to have an unnatural interest in the second crime scene. When the boy was arrested and interrogated, he offered a rambling half-confession to the more recent murder, alternately describing his acts in great detail and then, moments later, denying he'd done anything wrong. The police were certain that he had killed both girls. But no matter how hard they pushed him, the boy refused to confess to the first murder. By that time, police laboratories in England and America were accustomed to analyzing biological evidence, typically blood or semen, using a laboratory method called serology to determine blood type. It was useful for investigative purposes, but too imprecise to serve as a smoking gun. Serological testing that the police had expected would link the boy to the victims had come up negative, but, in light of the other evidence, they discounted the results. Someone mentioned to investigators a newspaper article about a local geneticist named Alec Jeffreys, who had developed a novel process for mapping gene variations using DNA molecules. Jeffreys, who would later be knighted for his contributions to forensic science, realized almost instantly the potential of the new technology, for which he coined the term genetic fingerprinting. Police asked Jeffreys to develop DNA profiles from the suspect's blood sample and from semen at the two crime scenes. The results stunned everyone. The same person had indeed raped and killed both girls. But he wasn't the boy whom police had in custody. The first criminal suspect ever subjected to forensic DNA testing was thus exonerated by it. The investigation went back to the drawing board in all respects except one. Police now had a DNA profile of their killer, who they suspected lived nearby. In January 1987, a bold plan was announced. The police requested that all male residents between the ages of 17 and 34 provide blood samples for DNA analysis, to eliminate themselves as suspects. No one was forced to participate in the blooding, as the DNA dragnet came to be called, and few expected that the killer would volunteer himself. But police hoped that the list of those who declined to participate would provide new leads. Several months and thousands of blood samples later, the police received a curious tip. A woman who worked at a bakery in Leicester had been gossiping with co-workers at a pub when one mentioned that he had agreed to take the blood test on someone else's behalf. The woman called the police, and the naive who'd taken the surrogate blood test promptly fingered the man who had talked him into it, a fellow baker with the improbable name of Colin Pitchfork. When confronted, Pitchfork confessed to the killings, and DNA analysis later confirmed that he had raped both girls. In January 1988, Pitchfork became the first murderer in history to be convicted on the basis of DNA evidence. All over the world, newspapers hailed the breakthrough and marveled at the ways DNA forensics might revolutionize detective work. Detective Stearns, had you ever met his wife? Stephanie Lazarus, I may have. Detective Stearns, do you remember her name or anything or what she did for a living or where she worked or anything about her? Stephanie Lazarus, well, I think she was a nurse. I don't understand why you're talking about some guy I dated a million years ago. Detective Jaramillo, yeah. Detective Stearns, well, do you know what happened to his wife? Stephanie Lazarus, yeah, I know she got killed. In Los Angeles, the first two defendants told by prosecutors that DNA evidence would be used against them promptly pleaded guilty. The third, in 1989, was an accused rapist named Henry Wilds. The prosecutor in his case was Lisa Kahn, a deputy in the district attorney's Van Nuys office, the same branch that would have handled the Rasmussen murder a few years earlier, had a suspect ever been arrested. Wilds was charged with committing 2 rapes, in 1986 and 1987. The LAPD had collected semen at both crime scenes, and Kahn received permission to submit the evidence to a private lab for DNA analysis, which confirmed that Wilds's DNA profile matched that of the rapist. Jury selection began in January 1990. Kahn recalls her desire to find jurors who would be able to make sense of this new universe of DNA testimony. We were looking for a bright jury, she explains. So I get up there first and I say, has anybody ever heard of DNA? Some little retired guy raises his hand and says, yeah, I know. It means does not apply. DNA experts testified for both sides. The jury, which included Kahn's little retired guy, voted to convict. In the wake of the successful prosecution, Kahn became responsible for handling any DNA admissibility hearing that took place in Los Angeles County. Forensic scientists and legal historians refer to the late 1980s and early 90s as the height of the DNA wars. As DNA evidence was accepted state by state, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, defense attorneys were initially helpless against the highly credentialed scientific experts called by prosecutors to testify. But that began to change in 1989, when two lawyers, Peter Neufeld and Barry Scheck, convinced a New York judge that poor laboratory procedures warranted exclusion of DNA evidence that had been introduced against their client. The decision, People v. Castro, sent shockwaves through the criminal justice system. Over the next few years, in courtrooms across America, the adversarial process worked its magic. All concerned prosecutors, defense lawyers, forensic scientists, judges had to raise their game. Laboratories became more careful with evidence, trial courts grew more familiar with DNA, and higher courts affirmed its admissibility as a matter of law. By 1994, the DNA wars were basically over, as a singular case would affirm. On June 13 of that year, LAPD homicide detectives visited the Rockingham Avenue mansion of O.J. Simpson to notify him that his ex-wife and an acquaintance of hers had been stabbed to death outside her Brentwood condominium. Simpson was soon linked to the crime by forensic evidence, in particular, a blood-soaked glove that a detective named Mark Foreman reported finding on Simpson's property. Defense lawyers would later suggest that Foreman had planted it. On behalf of the prosecution, Kahn coordinated the DNA testing of more than 50 blood samples that seemed to tie Simpson inextricably to the killings. Yet contrary to expectations, Simpson's dream team of defense lawyers did not fight to keep DNA results out, nor did they challenge the forensic value of DNA evidence during the trial. Ultimately, the not guilty verdict turned more on Foreman's alleged racism and the LAPD's carelessness in handling evidence than on the validity of the DNA. Indeed, by the end of the trial, the DNA results had ironically become a pillar of the defense's alternate narrative of the murder. Of course it was O.J.'s DNA, it had been planted at the scene. By one count, the term DNA was spoken in court 10,000 times during the 9-month trial, in addition to innumerable citations on television and in print. Just 5 years after a potential juror had confidently informed Lisa Kahn that DNA stood for does not apply, it had become a household term. Detective Stearns, and you think you thought you said you thought his wife was a nurse. Do you have any idea where she was working at the time, or did he ever mention that to you? Was it a hospital or a doctor's office? Stephanie Lazarus, I'm sure he must have mentioned it. I mean, now that you're bringing it up, I think she worked at a hospital somewhere. And, yeah, I may have met her at a hospital. I may have talked to her once or twice. Detective Stearns, at a hospital? Stephanie Lazarus, or more, you know? Even as forensic technology was taking great leaps forward, the investigation into Sherry Rasmussen's murder remained stalled. For years, her parents, Nels and Loretta, did everything possible to keep the case alive. In November 1987, they returned to Los Angeles and held a press conference, at which they renewed their offer of a $10,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. Sherry's widower, John Ruetten, was also there. It's been nearly 2 years of hell, not knowing who did this to Sherry or why, he told the assembled reporters. In 1988, Nels wrote a letter to then Chief of Police Daryl Gates requesting his intervention in the case, specifically looking into the possibility that an ex-girlfriend of Ruetten's who was a police officer might have been involved. He received no reply. About that time, Nels again mentioned the ex-girlfriend to the Van Nuys detectives. You watch too much television, he remembers being told. Into the early 1990s, Loretta called the Van Nuys homicide unit regularly to inquire about Sherry's case. In 1993, the Rasmussens traveled to Van Nuys for a face-to-face meeting with one of the detectives who had inherited the case when Lyle Meyer retired. Mayer's successor explained that he had reviewed the original case notes and tried to advance the investigation, but he had been unable to identify any suspects, and prospects for new leads were poor. Nels brought up an article about DNA forensics he had read in a science magazine and offered to pay for DNA analysis of the evidence at a private lab. The detective turned him down. "Move on with your lives," he advised the Rasmussens. After that meeting, Loretta's stopping calling. Meanwhile, in a freezer in the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, alongside biological evidence from hundreds of other murders, the swab of the bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's arm lay waiting for forensic science and the LAPD's scrutiny to catch up with it. "Detective Jaramillo, do you know what the circumstances were regarding her death?" Stephanie Lazarus: "Geez, let me think back. Geez, I didn't know if it was if it was burglary or something. Yeah, it's been so many years." Detective Jaramillo: "Do you remember her first name?" Stephanie Lazarus: "Sherry. I don't know. Something." If Lisa Kahn was the district attorney's resident DNA geek, that role in the LAPD was filled by Detective David Lampkin. In 1981, as a young cop, Lampkin had requested assignment to the Automated Information Division, which, among other responsibilities, maintained a citywide crime database that could be searched by modus operandi or other basic criteria, for instance, all liquor store robberies in which the suspect wore a mask. Primitive as the IBM punch card and mainframe computer databases might seem today, they were cutting edge at the time, and they nurtured Lampkin's interest in how technology could be used to solve cases. He made detective quickly and requested assignment to a sex crimes unit. Lampkin excelled at the work, but by 1990, he felt burned out and decided to shift to homicides. At the dawn of the DNA age, Lampkin's background investigating sex crimes proved an excellent foundation for homicide work. Given the number of drive-by shootings then occurring in the city, LAPD detectives were far more accustomed to picking shell casings up off the street than searching for hair strands, semen stains, and other barely visible bodily traces. Lampkin, by comparison, had been working with biological evidence for years, and was already convinced of DNA's potential. Moreover, he believed strongly that the LAPD had a moral obligation to do its best to solve cold cases. "For these families, this stuff never goes away," he says. In 1993, Lampkin was working homicide at the Hollywood Division, where he had a front row seat for the conclusion of perhaps the coldest case ever solved by the LAPD. The victim, Thora Rose, had been brutally killed in her apartment in October 1963. At the time, detectives had collected more than 30 fingerprint lifts from the scene, but they had never identified a suspect. In 1990, when the lifts were uploaded to a fingerprint database, the computer reported a match with a previously unknown suspect named Vernon Robinson. In 1963, Robinson had been an 18-year-old Navy recruit stationed in San Diego. After leaving the Navy in 1966, he fell into drugs and crime, and was eventually sentenced to 3 years at San Quentin for assault and robbery. Robinson emerged from prison a changed man. He got sober and enrolled in college. Later, he married and raised a family. When he was arrested for killing Thora Rose, Robinson was a 45-year-old manager for a building maintenance company in Minneapolis. The LAPD detective who arrested him had been 8 years old when the murder occurred. In court, Robinson cut a respectable figure. His children and members of his church packed the gallery in support of him. Deputy D.A. Paul Turley, in his closing argument, addressed head-on the defendant's evident rehabilitation and the 3 decades that had passed between the crime and the trial. "I'm very happy to stand in opposition to the principle that you are entitled to one free murder every 30 years, Turley told the jury. The jurors, and the judge, agreed. Robinson was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The Rose case made Lampkin eager to see how many other homicides from the city's past might be solved using new technology. LAPD homicide detectives had always been free to work cold cases, but only as time permitted between fresh murders, which wasn't very often. Now, using the new fingerprint and ballistics databases that had come online, Lampkin found he was able to clear some old homicides fairly easily. Although he didn't solve every fresh case he worked, he closed enough old ones to maintain a remarkable 100% personal clearance rate every year from 1991 through 1996. In October 1998, the FBI launched a DNA database called the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, which gave detectives the ability to compare DNA samples collected at crime scenes with the DNA profiles of legions of potential suspects. When, in 2000, a $50 million state grant became available to fund DNA testing in certain unsolved murders, Lampkin and Lisa Kahn seized the opportunity to propose a joint LAPD/D.A task force to tackle the citywide backlog. After considerable political machinations, the LAPD's new cold case homicide unit went operational in November 2001. The cold case unit initially consisted of 7 detectives, 3 teams of 2, with Lampkin at the helm. The office the unit was given a 250 square foot former janitorial storage space was so cramped that every time someone wanted to leave, others had to pull in their chairs to make room. The unit gradually came to grips with the magnitude of its caseload. The coldest homicide on the LAPD's books was, literally, the first one, the unsolved murder of a man named Simon Christensen in downtown Los Angeles on the night of September 9, 1899. A century later, the unit could not do much about that one. But how far back could they go, given the inevitable loss and decay of physical evidence? I knew from experience that there was probably nothing left from earlier than 1960, Lampkin says. The unit's initial focus would therefore be on unsolved homicides committed from 1960 through 1998. Using the LAPD's annual statistics, Lampkin tallied the numbers. During those 39 years, 23,713 murders took place in Los Angeles. Of those cases, 13,300 were cleared by arrest and another 2,668 were recorded as cleared other. That left 7,745 cold cases. Page by page, for months, the detectives combed the old homicide summary books. We were looking for cases that had the best chance for us to potentially work with, given the small numbers of detectives we had, says Rick Jackson, who was part of the original unit. So we looked for sexually motivated murders, where there was a better chance for DNA. We looked at maybe a burglary murder that was unsolved. Because a burglary murder, someone is going to have broken into the place, spent some time there. In an indoor crime scene, obviously, the longer you are there, the more you do, whether you're sexually assaulting, burglarizing, moving around, ransacking, you increase the chance for good fingerprints. Late in 2002, when the cold case unit finished its initial screening of all unsolved homicides committed in Los Angeles from 1960 through 1998, it judged 1,400 to have good forensic potential for reinvestigation, among them, the 1986 murder of Sherry Rasmussen. Stephanie Lazarus, that's now that you guys are bringing all this stuff up, that sounds familiar. But, again, what's this got to do with me dating him and, her getting killed? I don't have anything to do with it. Detective Stearns, well, like we said, we just, literally, got this the other day. And then so, obviously, it's, like. Stephanie Lazarus, yeah. Detective Stearns, we recognize the name, and we, Stephanie Lazarus, yeah. Detective Stearns, you work next door to us. And so we're trying to get some background. We're trying to figure this out. In February 2003, a year and a half after its formation, the cold case unit made its first arrest, solving the 1983 murder of a young nurse and mother named Elaine Graham. A suspect, Edmund Marr, had been identified at the time but was never prosecuted. Confronted with wiretap evidence and a DNA report that linked him to the murder, Marr eventually pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 16 years to life. 7 months later, in September, the unit cleared 4 cases at once when it arrested its first serial killer, Adolf Laudenberg. A 77-year-old grandfather with a bushy white beard, Laudenberg was suspected of having raped and strangled 4 women between 1972 and 1975. The media quickly dubbed him the Santa Claus Strangler. The detectives possessed the killer's DNA profile, but had no sample from Laudenberg with which they could compare it. A warrant could have forced their suspect to give them a sample, but they weren't sure they had enough evidence to get one. They could also have asked Laudenberg to submit a sample voluntarily, but that would have alerted him that he was a suspect. Detectives have a third way to get a suspect's DNA sample without running afoul of the Fourth Amendment: collect a voluntarily discarded sample. In this case, it would not be easy. Laudenberg lived in a mobile home that he moved sporadically around Los Angeles. Eventually, a detective arranged to meet at a donut shop to discuss what he described as a series of burglaries from automobiles. Afterward, the coffee cup the old man had used was whisked to the lab and his DNA was harvested from the brim. The profiles matched, and Laudenberg is now serving a life sentence. The press loves these cases, Lampkin says. I mean, it is all positive every time you solve one. If you don't solve one, well, no one solved it. But when you do, you're like a freaking magician. During the summer and fall of 2003, Lampkin's unit was working its way, case by case, through the 1,400 unsolved homicides it had flagged as having good forensic potential. On September 19, DNA analysis was requested on evidence from the 1986 murder of Sherry Rasmussen. The request reached the desk of a criminalist at the LAPD crime lab, but given staffing shortages, no action was taken on it for more than a year. In December 2004, a criminalist named Jennifer Butterworth noticed the unworked request sitting on her colleague's desk and volunteered to handle it. The first article Butterworth analyzed was a blood swatch taken at the victim's autopsy, which gave her Rasmussen's DNA profile. When she turned to the crime scene evidence, the items she initially tested, a piece of fingernail, a blood-stained towel, yielded only the victim's profile. Then Butterworth noticed that the property sheet listed a bite mark swab. Yet she couldn't find the swab in the rape kit or anywhere else. A week went by before the coroner's office could locate the missing evidence. The 5 by 7-inch envelope, new and crisp when Lloyd Mahoney had sealed it in 1986, was no longer so pristine. Its condition would later be described in court as pretty beaten up and ratty. There was a tear at one end, from which protruded the red cap top of the tube holding the swab, but the tube itself appeared intact. When Butterworth analyzed the swab, it yielded a mixture of 2 DNA profiles, one of which matched Rasmussen's. The other presumably belonged to her killer. This mystery profile did not return a Cody's hit, which meant the suspect was not in the FBI's DNA database. But a curious detail caught Butterworth's eye. DNA profiles developed since the late 1990s typically include a gender marker. In most violent crimes, the suspect comes up XY, or male. But the DNA results in front of Butterworth were XX, meaning that the person who bit Sherry Rasmussen was female. Without the case file, Butterworth had little information regarding theories of the case or possible suspects, and so lacked context for her discovery. But it was certainly unusual. She typed up her conclusions and sent the report to the Cold Case Unit on February 8, 2005. As it happened, just a few months before, California voters had overwhelmingly approved Proposition 69, a ballot measure co-authored by Lisa Kahn. Prop 69 required police to collect DNA samples from all individuals arrested for a felony or a sex crime, as well as from all state prison inmates who had been convicted of such crimes. The DNA profiles of tens of thousands of California inmates were uploaded to the FBI's vast database. As a result, In 2005, Lampkin's unit was swamped with Cody's-based cold hits, DNA reports implicating suspects previously unknown to detectives. As tantalizing a clue as Butterworth's DNA report provided in the Rasmussen case, namely, that a woman might be the murderer, it did not point directly to a specific suspect, unlike the many cold hits rolling in thanks to Prop 69. Perhaps for this reason, Butterworth's report went into the Rasmussen case file, and the case file itself went back on the shelf, where it would sit for a few years more. Detective Jaramillo, I know you went to talk with her at the hospital regarding this issue with John too, you know, kind of like, hey, you know, what's going to happen with this thing. But would you ever have followed up to her house where you went to talk to her to say, hey, you know what? Stephanie Lazarus, I don't even know that I knew where they lived. Detective Stearns, but you didn't have any issues with her, right? Stephanie Lazarus, no, I mean, you know, obviously, if he was dating me and dating her, I probably said, hey, pick or something, you know. By early 2007, when David Lampkin retired, the cold case homicide unit had solved more than 40 old murder cases. His successor was Robert Bubb, another veteran homicide detective. Bubb estimates that when he took over the unit, it numbered 10 detectives and had about 120 cases open. The team had by then moved to a new, slightly more spacious squad room on the 5th floor of Parker Center, the LAPD's legendarily decrepit headquarters, but it still didn't have enough space for all the murder books that it had accumulated. Detectives boxed up whichever cases weren't being actively worked and sent them back to the divisions where they had originated, if there was room for them, or to the LAPD archives if there wasn't. As a result, sometime in 2007, the Sherry Rasmussen case file was returned to the Van Nuys division in a cardboard box. By coincidence, Bubb followed it in March 2008, when he accepted a transfer to run the Van Nuys homicide unit, which had just lost its supervising detective and 2 others to retirement. When the dust settled, the squad consisted of Bubb and 3 other detectives, Pete Barba, Mark Martinez, and Jim Nuttall. Whereas Van Nuys once recorded 30 to 40 homicides a year, nowadays it averages 5 to 7. It's a very manageable number of murders for 3 guys to work, Bubb says. In early February 2009, with the squad's most recent homicide cleared, Nuttall and Barba began poking around for an interesting cold case. They settled on Sherry Rasmussen's. It was 4 books when it reached me, 4 books deep, Nuttall says of the case file. They kept a pretty good chronological record of everything that was done over 23 years. When Nuttall reached the 2005 DNA analysis report, he saw immediately that the gender marker was incompatible with the original theory of the case. That jumps off the page at you, because when you have that, and you're aware that the case is based on 2 male burglars, well, that alters the entire course of the investigation. You have to go back to square one. The detectives went back over the whole investigation, but this time with the assumption that they were looking for a female suspect. When they finished going through the case file, they had a list of 5 names, among them that of Stephanie Lazarus, who was cited in the original police work as John Rueten's ex-girlfriend, with the further notation P.O. Nuttall didn't make anything of the initials until he called Rueten, who told him that Lazarus had been a Los Angeles police officer. Nuttall was stunned at the thought that a cop might have killed someone and gotten away with it. It was extremely difficult initially to process that possibility, he says. Wondering whether she might still be on the job, the detectives typed her name into the LAPD's directory, and there she was, Detective Stephanie Lazarus. Nuttall phoned Bubb and told him they had identified the police officer ex-girlfriend whom Nels Rasmussen had brought up all those years before. The suspects on the squad's list were numbered 1 through 5. Lazarus, considered the least likely suspect, was number 5. The detectives on the Van Nuys squad made 2 pacts regarding the Rasmussen case. First, they agreed that they would maintain total secrecy, and would never speak or write Lazarus's name where anyone else might hear or see it. There was no way to know who in the division might be acquainted with her, and they didn't want to dirty her good name in the likely event that she didn't have anything to do with the murder or tip her off in the unlikely event that she did. Second, they promised one another that they would follow the trail of evidence wherever it led. This was not a random act of violence toward Sherry Rasmussen, Nuttall says. Somebody on that list committed this crime. Stephanie Lazarus, oh, yeah, my cars have been broken into, you know, but no cars have ever been stolen. Detective Jaramillo, uh-huh. How long? Well, when tell me about this, the car getting broken into. Stephanie Lazarus, well, my car had been broken into several times. Detective Jaramillo, oh, really? Did you ever lose anything or? Stephanie Lazarus, yeah, now that you mention it. Let's see. I had a gun that was stolen. The Van Nuys detectives quickly eliminated 3 of the 5 women on their list for having insufficient motive to harm Rasmussen. That left them with only 2 suspects, Lazarus and one other woman, a fellow nurse who, according to the original case notes, had occasionally argued with Sherry at the hospital. We were teetering, Bub recalls. But as far as motive was concerned, the information that we had was that Lazarus and Rueten's relationship had been over since the previous summer. We didn't have anything to establish there was any animosity. The detectives decided they would investigate the nurse first, confirming or eliminating her as a suspect. She was located living in Northern California, and Bub made arrangements with local law enforcement to surreptitiously collect a DNA sample from her. In mid-April, just over 2 months into the new investigation, that DNA report came back negative. The detectives' list was down to one name, Stephanie Lazarus. Fact by fact, the team began piecing together Lazarus's relationship to Sherry Rasmussen. Lazarus and John Rueten had become close friends at UCLA, where they'd lived in the same dorm. After graduating in the early 1980s, they dated on and off. In 1985, Rueten began dating Rasmussen seriously. He proposed to her that summer, and they married in November. 3 months later, she was dead. At the time, Lazarus was a 26-year-old patrol officer in her 3rd year with the LAPD. In 1993, she made detective, and in 1996 she married a fellow LAPD officer, with whom she later adopted a little girl. In 2006, Lazarus was assigned to the department's art theft detail, a plum post with a degree of prestige rare for Los Angeles police work. In her long career, she had never been involved in a use of force incident or been accused of any misconduct. Still, as the Van Nuys unit continued to dig, other details fell uncomfortably into place. Mark Martinez recalled that in the mid-1980s, most LAPD cops carried a .38 as their backup or off-duty gun, the same caliber weapon indicated on the ballistics report in the Rasmussen murder book. On April 30, the detectives entered Lazarus's name into the California State Gun Registry, which returned a list of all the firearms she had ever registered. One of them, a .38, had been reported stolen on March 9, 1986, 13 days after the murder. Within a week, the detectives obtained a copy of the stolen gun report. It indicated that shortly after 2 p.m. that Sunday, Lazarus had walked into the lobby of the Santa Monica Police Department, identified herself as an LAPD officer, and told the clerk that her car, parked near Santa Monica Pier, had been broken into. The lock on the driver's side door had been punched, she said, and a blue gym bag stolen. Lazarus listed for the clerk the contents of the stolen bag: clothes, half a dozen cassette tapes, and the handgun, which she described as a Smith & Wesson 5-shot .38 revolver. Without that gun, or, more precisely, without a bullet known to have been fired from it, the Van Nuys detectives would have no way to prove, or disprove, that it was the murder weapon. By this time, Nuttall had spoken on the phone with Nels Rasmussen, Sherry's father, whose persistence and intelligence impressed him. I said, "We need to talk about everything. I need you to walk me through everything from A to Z," Nuttall recalls. He asked Nels about women who might have wanted to harm Sherry, and Nels recounted what he had told detectives in 1986 about Rueten's cop ex-girlfriend, who his daughter said had confronted her at the hospital where she worked. Given the sensitivity of the unfolding investigation, Nuttall had to be cautious about tipping his hand. But he told Nels, "Give me time to do what I have to do, and I think I'll be able to have an answer for you." Detective Stearns: "Did you have a fight with her?" Stephanie Lazarus: "You mean like we fought?" Detective Stearns: "Yeah, did you ever duke it out with her?" Stephanie Lazarus: "No, I don't think so. I mean, it just doesn't sound familiar. I mean, what are they saying?" "So I fought with her, so, now, I'm getting the jump the leap. They're saying, okay, I fought with her, so I must have killed her. I mean, come on. I mean that's I don't even know who those people are. I can't even say I met any of these people. I mean, it's insane." If a case against Lazarus was going to proceed, it was inevitably going to end up with the department's Robbery Homicide Division, the elite detective unit that handles the city's most sensitive and high-profile murder cases. Bub, a veteran of RHD, was determined to deliver an ultra-professional case to them. The detectives had known for a while that they would need to obtain a sample of Lazarus's DNA to compare with the bite mark swab. "We had kicked around the idea of doing it ourselves, doing surreptitious DNA," Bub says. "But the way the circumstances were, there would have been too many variables involved and too much potential for screw-up. We felt it best, if we're going to do this and hand the package to RHD, we're going to hand it to them with everything done correctly." Bub went to his lieutenant in the Van Nuys division and briefed him on the investigation. Outside of Bub and the three men in his unit, the lieutenant was the first person in the department to learn that an LAPD detective had become a cold case murder suspect. The captain of the Van Nuys division and his commanding officer, the chief of the Valley Bureau, were quickly brought into the loop. "We explained that this could still turn out not to be her," Bub says. "There were some coincidences, but there was nothing definitive for us at this point." The chief decided that Bub's unit could hang on to the case until the DNA sample was obtained. Back at the squad room, the detectives prepared for two possible outcomes. If Lazarus's DNA matched the sample from the swab, RHD would assume responsibility for the case. If it didn't match, the Rasmussen case would be designated investigation continued and shelved yet again, probably forever. On May 19, 2009, the Van Nuys detectives met off-site with detectives from the LAPD's Professional Standards Bureau, a surveillance unit directly under the command of the Chief of Police, who was then William Bratton. On May 27, after a week of preparation and surveillance, plainclothes detectives surreptitiously trailed Lazarus as she ran errands. When she threw out a cup and straw she had been drinking from, the surveillance team swooped in and retrieved it from the trash. At the Scientific Investigation Division, a DNA profile was quickly developed from the saliva on the straw and compared with the unidentified profile extracted from the bite mark swab. On May 29, Bub was on a day off when his cell phone rang. The call was from a technician at the crime lab. Bub recalls, it was one of those gut-wrenching moments when he said, "Yes, it's a match." Stephanie Lazarus: "I wish I had been recording this, because now it sounds like, you're telling me these people say I'm fighting with her. And, now, it sounds like you're trying to, I've been doing this a long time." Detective Jaramillo: "Yeah." Detective Stearns: "We know." Stephanie Lazarus: "Okay. And, now, it almost sounds like you're trying to pin something on me." The art theft detail where Lazarus worked was on the third floor of Parker Center, just across the hall from the Robbery Homicide Division squad room. Lazarus was friendly with a number of RHD detectives, which made assigning the case a challenge. The two detectives who were ultimately chosen, Greg Stearns and Dan Jaramillo, were selected in part because they did not know Lazarus well, and had no bias for or against her. Bub says maintaining the secrecy of the investigation was a top priority. Detectives are gossipy, he explains. That's the nature of being a detective, we all want to know. Within hours of receiving the DNA results, Bub and Nuttall brought the 4 binders that comprised the Rasmussen case file to Stearns and Jaramillo at Parker Center. We're giving them the spiel of where we are and how we got here, what's been going on for 23 years, Nuttall recalls. Dan and Greg aren't asking questions yet, because they're still absorbing this information that's just overwhelming. When they finished, all 4 detectives went straight from RHD to the D.A.S. office, where Bub and Nuttall briefed the prosecutors who would be handling the case. To maintain secrecy, Stearns, Jaramillo, and Nuttall spent the next week working out of a conference room at the D.A.S. office. While Stearns and Jaramillo began planning their strategy for interviewing Lazarus, Nuttall, and Lisa Sanchez, another RHD detective, flew to Arizona to meet with the Rasmussen family. Because many more people within the LAPD and the D.A.S. office were now aware of where the investigation was headed, concern was growing that word could leak at any moment. Nuttall and Sanchez were tasked with getting on the record statements from the Rasmussens and updating them on the investigation, without tipping them off to just how close the police were to making an arrest. Despite his many phone conversations with Nels, Nuttall had never met the Rasmussens in person, and he was nervous about the encounter. The night before, and all through the morning, he went over in his head exactly what he was going to say to them. The hardest part was, I thought, man, Nels is going to undress this. He's going to know I know. He's not going to miss this. When the 2 LAPD detectives pulled up to the house, Nels came out to the driveway to greet them. The whole family was waiting inside. He walks me in, Nuttall recalls, and I drew a blank on what I was going to say. The awkward silence was broken when Loretta crossed the room to where Nuttall stood, and hugged him. Here's this woman who never said 2 words to me, Nuttall says. She just walked across the room and she gave me a hug. Before the detectives left, Nuttall made one last plea for the family's patience. The detectives returned to Los Angeles and dug back into the case with Stearns and Jaramillo. One of the thorny issues still to be resolved was how and where to confront Lazarus. Chief Bratton didn't want anybody approaching her when she had a gun or access to a gun, Nuttall explains. There was no way anybody was going to sign off on us going into the house with a search warrant in the middle of the night and it maybe ending in tragedy. In the end, they decided to stage the interview at Parker Center's jail division, located on the floor directly below the robbery homicide division and the art theft detail. Firearms were not allowed in the jail, so it would not seem unnatural for all 3 detectives Stearns, Jaramillo, and Lazarus to surrender their guns before entering. The plan was for the RHD detectives to request Lazarus's help interviewing a jailed suspect who claimed to have information on an art theft case. When she arrived at the interrogation room, one equipped with recording equipment to videotape the interview, they would shift gears and gradually turn to the Rasmussen case. Given how many suspects Lazarus had arrested herself over the years, she was undoubtedly well aware of her rights to silence and to legal counsel. The unknown factor was how long she would wait before invoking one or both. Everything I knew about Stephanie, she was sharp, Nuttall says. Stearns and Jaramillo's goal would be to keep her talking as long as possible, while simultaneously assuring her that she was free to leave at any time. She would be, but only technically. As Stearns and Jaramillo would know, but Lazarus could hardly suspect, the moment she ended the interview and walked out of the room, she would be arrested, regardless of what she had told them. The interview was scheduled for early in the workday on Friday, June 5. Chief Bratton wanted the Rasmussen family informed of the arrest in person as soon as it happened, so they didn't hear about it through the media. Nuttall was tapped for the job. He called the Rasmussens and said he was coming back and would need to see them again on Friday morning. Nels replied that he had a doctor's appointment. Nuttall recalls, I said, Nels, if you can reschedule it, you may want to reschedule. At 6:40 a.m. on June 5, 2009, Jaramillo stopped by Lazarus's desk. He was wearing a wire. "Stephanie," he asked. "Do you know me? I'm Dan Jaramillo. I work over here on the other side." He explained that he was working on a case and had a suspect in the jail who was talking about stolen art. "I don't know a lot about this stuff," he told Lazarus. "You can kind of talk to him. You can see if he's for real." "Sure," she said. "Just for like 5 minutes or something," Jaramillo added. When Lazarus arrived in the interrogation room, Stearns and Jaramillo abandoned the story of a suspect talking about stolen art, and explained that her name had come up in a case involving an ex-boyfriend of hers, John Ruetan. Knowing she was married to someone else, they told her they'd selected a place where they could speak privately, away from gossiping colleagues. Stearns and Jaramillo interviewed Lazarus for more than an hour, coming at her in an oblique manner that left it unclear whether they were speaking with her as a possible witness or a criminal suspect. The conversation meandered, but every digression led back, inevitably, to the murder of Sherry Rasmussen. It was only after Jaramillo asked Lazarus if she'd be willing to give them a DNA swab and noted, "It's possible we may have some DNA at the location," that she said she wanted to contact a lawyer. Declaring herself shocked, the veteran detective stood and walked out, 68 minutes after she'd sat down. Lazarus got only as far as the jail's hallway, where she was stopped by other RHD detectives and placed in handcuffs. Unidentified speaker, "Too tight? Which one, left or right?" "Stephanie Lazarus, you know, it's the left but that's I think it's just, hitting my watch." Unidentified speaker, "Yeah. You want me to take your watch off?" "They're going to take it off anyway." "Property bag?" Stephanie Lazarus, "Well, just." Detective Stearns, "Yeah, just put it in here." "Go ahead and grab her ring, too." "Want to stand up for just a second?" Stephanie Lazarus, "Oh, geez. See if I can get it off." Detective Stearns, "Okay." Stephanie Lazarus, "I'm going to probably have to lick my finger. I need a little spit." Lazarus and the detectives discuss other topics for a while: a torn ACL she suffered playing basketball, medication she needs to take every morning before returning to the ring. Unidentified speaker, they still have your property over there, if you want to take your ring off." Saliva works wonders. Stephanie Lazarus, "Yeah." From the interrogation room, Lazarus was taken to Linwood, the Los Angeles County Jail facility for female prisoners, where she has been held ever since on $10 million bail. On June 8, 2009, she was charged with the murder of Sherry Rasmussen. Since her arrest, Lazarus has steadfastly maintained her innocence. Through her lawyer, she declined the Atlantic's interview request. Her trial is tentatively scheduled to begin in late August. Stretry 3. The Hunt for the Dark Web's Biggest Kingpin, Part 1, The Shadow. The notorious Alpha 02 oversaw millions of dollars a day in online narcotic sales. For cybercrime detectives, he was public enemy number one and a total mystery. On the morning of July 5, 2017, a gray Toyota Camry slowly turned into the cul-de-sac of a quiet neighborhood in Bangkok, a moderately upscale subdivision on the western edge of the city, where the pulsating capital's downtown high-rises began to flatten out into highways and canals snaking through tropical forest and farmlands. Behind the wheel sat a woman who went by the nickname Nguyen. A slight, 46-year-old agent of the Royal Thai Police with a short, boyish haircut, she wore a white polo shirt and black pants rather than her usual military-style uniform. Both she and the female officer beside her in the passenger seat were working undercover. Nguyen's heart pounded. For more than 2 years, law enforcement agents from around the world had been hunting the dark web mastermind known as Alpha 02, a shadowy figure who oversaw millions of dollars a day in narcotics sales and had built the largest digital drug and crime bazaar in history, known as Alphabet. Now, A coordinated takedown and sting involving no fewer than 6 countries' agencies had tracked Alpha 02 to Thailand. The operation had finally led to this quiet block in Bangkok, to the home of a 26-year-old Canadian named Alexander Cases. Nguyen knew that the success of the plot to arrest Cases and knock out this linchpin of the global underworld economy hinged on what she did in the next few moments. Trying to give the impression of an inexperienced driver, Nguyen slowly rolled the car toward a model home and real estate office at the end of the cul-de-sac. She signaled to a security guard outside the house that she had taken a wrong turn and needed to pull a 180. She heard him shout at her to back directly out instead, that the street was too narrow for a 3-point turn. Nguyen quickly muttered a nearly silent prayer and adapted, high-speed plea to the Holy Trinity of the Buddha, his teachings, and all the monks and nuns in his service. "Dear Buddha, please bless me with success," she whispered in Thai. "Dear Dhamma, please bless me with success. Dear Sangha, please bless me with success." Then she put the car in reverse, turned the wheel to the left, and ever so gently, almost in slow motion, slammed the Toyota's fender into Alexander Case's front gate. Around 18 months earlier, Robert Miller sat in the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration's wiretap room in Fresno, California, spending another painfully boring day listening in on the life of one of the D's endless supply of narcotics targets in California's Central Valley. All Miller ever wanted was to be on a SWAT team. At the academy, instructors had praised him for his instinctive judgment and thoroughness. How, in training raids on the academy's mock UPS of drug dens, he always meticulously cleared his corners and covered his blind spots. And when the young DEA agent was assigned to the agency's field office in Fresno right after graduation, he had high hopes it would put him where he wanted to be, making arrests, carrying out search warrants, hitting doors, as he put it. Miller's name and some personal details have been changed, per his request. The sun-baked agricultural city in the middle of California had long served as a corridor for cocaine, heroin, weed, and methamphetamine smugglers, as traffickers from the southern border made their way to buyers in the northwest and on the east coast. Agents spent their days carrying out undercover buy-and busts, following trucks packed with dope along Highway 99 and tracking, raiding, and arresting cartel operators. But not long after he moved to Fresno, Miller injured his foot and his shoulder while rock climbing. Both injuries required surgery. There would be no SWAT team, no hitting doors, not, at least, for the 2 years it would take to recover. So Miller was assigned to surveillance. He'd stake out targets from his car or sit in the office's wiretap room, listening to suspects' phone calls and reading their texts for weeks or sometimes months on end. The work was often mind-numbingly mundane. 99% boredom and 1% excitement, as he remembers it. At one point in 2013, Miller's partner on a surveillance assignment suggested they try to work on a new sort of case. She had heard about a booming drug market on the dark web called Silk Road, a site where anyone could connect through the anonymity software Tor and spend bitcoins to buy any drug imaginable, and its pseudonymous creator, the Dread Pirate Roberts. But when Miller asked his superiors about the site, he was told that teams in New York and Baltimore were already on it. Not long after, while Miller was on a surveillance stakeout in his car in a mall parking lot, his phone buzzed with an alert that the notorious market had been busted. The Dread Pirate Roberts turned out to be a 29-year-old Texan with no criminal record named Ross Ulbricht. He had been arrested in the science fiction section of San Francisco's Glen Park Public Library with his laptop open and logged into Silk Road. 2 long years later, in early 2016, Miller's boss came into the wiretap room and asked whether Miller wanted to join a different team. Someone in the office had remembered Miller's inquiry into Silk Road. A local assistant U.S. attorney had assembled a group to focus on dark web crime, and he was looking for volunteers from all the federal agencies clustered around Courthouse Park in Fresno's downtown square, the Internal Revenue Service, Homeland Security Investigations, and the Drug Enforcement Administration. The assignment, Miller knew, was pretty much the opposite of the SWAT team. But at least it would be something new. "Okay," he said. "I'll do it." Grant Rabin, the young prosecutor at the helm of Fresno's dark web strike force, laid out a set of modest initial goals for the group. They would be going after individual money launderers and drug dealers, not kingpins and masterminds. We are not the Southern District of New York. We are in a dusty town in the Central Valley of California, as Rabin put it. Let's hit singles before we try to go for a home run. That humble starting point was fine with Miller, who had little idea of how the dark web drug trade even worked. When Rabin asked Miller to start making undercover heroin buys, he couldn't figure out how to buy bitcoins, let alone the drugs themselves. He drove 2.5 hours to San Jose to find a physical Bitcoin ATM rather than simply use an online exchange. Even then, he discovered that after transaction fees he could purchase only half a gram of heroin instead of the 2 grams he'd planned on. But slowly, as Miller poked around the dark web and perused the various markets, he got a feel for the post-Silk Road online drug economy. He soon came to see that it was dominated by a single entity, Alphabet. Alphabet had first appeared in late 2014, just one in the broad scrum of markets vying for a share of the growing dark web criminal trade. But the site's pseudonymous administrator, Alpha02, seemed cannier than those behind many of the competing markets. Alpha02 was a well-known if not exceptionally talented carder, a cybercriminal hacker focused on credit card theft and fraud. He'd become a significant player on Tor Carding Forum, a dark website where hackers traded in stolen data. He'd even sold his own 16-page University of Carding guide, designed to teach beginners the tricks of the trade, like how to social engineer customer service representatives at banks, calling from spoofed telephone numbers to deceive them into approving fraudulent transactions. In its first months online, Alphabet seemed destined to serve much the same hacker clientele. It was devoted almost exclusively to cybercriminal wares, such as stolen account logins and credit card data. But as Alpha02 bootstrapped the site from its carder origins, its portfolio of vendors quickly expanded to offer the dark web's more lucrative contraband, ecstasy, marijuana, meth, cocaine, and heroin, all shipped through the mail. Soon it became clear that Alpha02's grand vision was to unite two spheres of the dark web that had, until then, been somewhat distinct, one devoted to cybercrime and the other to drugs, to create a single megamarket. Alphabet's goal, he declared, was to become the largest eBay-style underworld marketplace. Silk Road's dread pirate Roberts had espoused a kind of anarcho-capitalist ideal, describing his site as a movement or a revolution bent on liberating mankind from oppressive government control of commerce and limiting sellers, at least in theory, to offering only victimless products. Alpha02, by contrast, seemed to adopt a much less high-minded focus on the bottom line. Aside from a ban on child abuse materials and murder for hire, the only rule Alpha02 imposed on Alphabet's vendors was that they not sell data or accounts stolen from Russia or other former Soviet states, or infect those countries' computers with malware. This prohibition, common among cybercriminals from that part of the world, was typically designed to avoid trouble from Russian law enforcement, a kind of "don't shit where you sleep" principle. For Miller and other federal agents and prosecutors sniffing around the site, it also suggested that Alphabet and its mysterious founder were likely based in Russia, an impression cemented by Alpha02's signature in messages on the site's forums, Russian for "Be safe, brothers." In an interview in April 2015 with the news site and dark web directory Deep.web, Alpha02 reassured his users that he and his site were beyond the reach of any Silk Road-style seizure. "I am absolutely certain my OPSEC is secure," he wrote, using the shorthand for operational security, and added, "I live in an offshore country where I am safe." Alphabet had first appeared in late 2014, just one in the broad scrum of markets vying for a share of the growing dark web criminal trade. But the site's pseudonymous administrator, Alpha02, seemed cannier than those behind many of the competing markets. Alpha02 was a well-known if not exceptionally talented carder, a cybercriminal hacker focused on credit card theft and fraud. He'd become a significant player on Tor Carding Forum, a dark website where hackers traded in stolen data. He'd even sold his own 16-page University of Carding guide, designed to teach beginners the tricks of the trade, like how to social engineer customer service representatives at banks, calling from spoofed telephone numbers to deceive them into approving fraudulent transactions. In its first months online, Alphabet seemed destined to serve much the same hacker clientele. It was devoted almost exclusively to cybercriminal wares, such as stolen account logins and credit card data. But as Alpha02 bootstrapped the site from its Carter origins, its portfolio of vendors quickly expanded to offer the dark web's more lucrative contraband, ecstasy, marijuana, meth, cocaine, and heroin, all shipped through the mail. Soon it became clear that Alpha02's grand vision was to unite two spheres of the dark web that had, until then, been somewhat distinct, one devoted to cybercrime and the other to drugs, to create a single megamarket. Alphabet's goal, he declared, was to become the largest eBay-style underworld marketplace. Silk Road's dread pirate Roberts had espoused a kind of anarcho-capitalist ideal, describing his site as a movement or a revolution bent on liberating mankind from oppressive government control of commerce and limiting sellers, at least in theory, to offering only victimless products. Alpha02, by contrast, seemed to adopt a much less high-minded focus on the bottom line. Aside from a ban on child abuse materials and murder for hire, the only rule Alpha02 imposed on Alphabet's vendors was that they not sell data or accounts stolen from Russia or other former Soviet states, or infect those countries' computers with malware. This prohibition, common among cybercriminals from that part of the world, was typically designed to avoid trouble from Russian law enforcement, a kind of "don't shit where you sleep" principle. For Miller and other federal agents and prosecutors sniffing around the site, it also suggested that Alphabet and its mysterious founder were likely based in Russia, an impression cemented by Alpha02's signature in messages on the site's forums, Russian for "Be safe, brothers." In an interview in April 2015 with the news site and dark web directory Deep.web, Alpha02 reassured his users that he and his site were beyond the reach of any Silk Road-style seizure. "I am absolutely certain my OPSEC is secure," he wrote, using the shorthand for operational security, and added, "I live in an offshore country where I am safe." Throughout that interview, Alpha02 wrote in the style of a corporate press release, "We have made sure to have created a stable and fast marketplace web application which has been built with security in mind right from the start," he wrote, adding, "We would like to assure all of our users, both vendors and buyers, that their security, privacy, and anonymity rank first place in our priorities list." What Alpha02 lacked in political inspiration he seemed to make up for in technological aspiration and coding competency. He boasted about features that included auction-style bidding, search tools that helped fraudsters comb through stolen data to carefully choose their victims, and a multi-signature transaction scheme designed to reassure users that it would be far harder for law enforcement or rogue staff to steal funds held in escrow. Among digital crime investigators, Alpha02's notoriety was like that of Osama bin Laden. He and Alphabet were invoked at every law enforcement conference on cybercrime, every interagency meeting, every training event. "We want to have every imaginable possible feature to be the number one market," he wrote to Deep.web. On each page of Alphabet, he'd signed his work, proudly designed by Alpha02. When a judge imposed a double life sentence on the Silk Road's Ross Ulbricht in May 2015, she told the court that the draconian sentence was partly meant to scare off future dark web drug buyers, dealers, and administrators. By the time of Alphabet's rise, that unprecedented punishment seemed to have had the opposite effect. A study in the British Journal of Criminology found that sales on what was then the top dark website, Agora, more than doubled in the days following the news of Ulbricht's sentencing, to more than $350,000 a day. The study's author, trying to interpret that unexpected increase, reasoned that by imposing such a shocking prison term, the judge had only generated new awareness of the dark web drug trade. Rather than deterring users, the judge seemed to have created a massive advertisement for the world's burgeoning cryptocurrency black markets. Alpha 02 was hardly fazed by the news. Following Ulbricht's sentencing, in an interview with Vice's tech news site, Motherboard, he momentarily affected a revolutionary posture, picking up the dread pirate Robert's torch. "Courts can stop a man, but they can't stop an ideology," he wrote. "Darknet markets will always be around, until the war on drugs stops." But in response to other questions, Alphabety's boss seemed to ditch the torch and speak more plainly. "We have to carry on with business," he wrote. "We all need money to eat." By the fall of 2015, Alphabety was the biggest market on the dark web. Agora's administrators had taken their site offline that August, citing concerns that a vulnerability in Tor, the online anonymity system that powered the dark web, might be used to locate Agora's servers. Alphabety appeared to have no such security flaw. As it absorbed Agora's tens of thousands of buyers and vendors, the growing crowd of law enforcement agents around the world surveilling the site could find no coding or OPSEC slip-ups to give them the slightest clue as to where they might find its servers, not to mention its founder. Shortly before Alphabety took over the dark web's top spot, Alpha 02 had changed his username on the site to merely admin and announced that he would no longer accept any private messages sent to him by anyone other than Alphabety's staff. Instead, he left much of the site's communications work to his second-in-command and head of security, a figure who went by the pseudonym The Snake. The Alpha 02 moniker had served its purpose, lending the site its initial credibility. Now the person behind it intended, like discreet criminal bosses the world over, to slip into the shadows, raking in his fortune as quietly and anonymously as possible. That fortune was, by the time of Alpha 02's name change, growing at an unprecedented rate. By October 2015, Alphabety had more than 200,000 users and more than 21,000 product listings for drugs, compared to just 12,000 listings on Silk Road at its peak. Sometime around the middle of 2016, Alphabety surpassed Agora's peak sales rate of $350,000 a day, according to researchers at Carnegie Mellon. It had become not only the biggest black market on the dark web, but the biggest cryptocurrency black market of all time. And it was still growing wildly. For Grant Rabin, the Fresno-based prosecutor, it was clear that Alpha 02 was now the most wanted man on the dark web. Rabin compared his notoriety among digital crime investigators to that of Osama bin Laden. Alphabety and Alpha 02 were invoked at every law enforcement conference on cybercrime, every interagency meeting, every training event, Rabin says. And as the target on Alpha 02's back loomed larger, so too did the unspoken fear that this mastermind might stay a step ahead of them indefinitely. Is this person just a pure genius who's figured out all of the possible mistakes? Rabin remembers asking himself. Has this individual found the perfect country with the right IT infrastructure to run a marketplace, and he's able to bribe the officials there so we'll never touch him? As every day passed there was, more and more, a sense that this might be the special one, Rabin says. You begin to wonder, is this the Michael Jordan of the dark web? But Rabin followed these discussions of Alpha 02 from a distance. The idea that his Fresno team might actually take on the Michael Jordan of the dark web had never occurred to him. It's not expected for people like us, he says simply, to go after a site like that. The tip. Before Grant Rabin became a federal prosecutor, his second job out of law school was at a boutique firm in Washington, D.C., devoted to defending white-collar criminals. The young, olive-skinned lawyer with dark hair and a Hollywood smile ended up representing Russian oligarchs and corporate executives accused of bribing foreign governments. Very interesting, wealthy people trying to hide their assets and avoid scrutiny, as he described them, or alternatively, James Bond characters who are jet-setting around the world with suitcases full of cash. Rabin was captivated by these glimpses into a world of billions of dollars moving in invisible transactions. But he also found that he admired and envied the prosecutors on the other side of the table, the way they worked in the public interest and possessed a certain autonomy, choosing which cases they would pursue. So he began applying for Justice Department jobs, finally finding one in Fresno. Despite having grown up in Southern California, Rabin couldn't place Fresno on a map. But when he arrived at its DOJ office in 2011, he found what he'd always wanted, a place with almost no hierarchy or bureaucracy, where he was simply told to focus on money laundering and was otherwise given free rein. For the next few years, he and the local agents tackled fraud and extortion, child exploitation, corrupt cops, and, of course, drug trafficking, following illicit trails of money wherever they led. "We were just running and gunning," Rabin says of those prolific years with a boyish enthusiasm. Rabin's money laundering cases often began with the stream of suspicious activity reports that banks were required to file under the Bank Secrecy Act. By mid-2013, Rabin found that more and more of those reports were being triggered by financial transfers out of crypto exchanges, platforms where users could trade digital currency for traditional money like dollars, euros, or yen. The banks often suspected that these currency swaps were cash-outs of dirty digital profits. So Rabin immersed himself in dozens of hours of YouTube videos to understand this still new currency called Bitcoin, its mechanics, and how it seemed to be powering an anonymous underworld of online commerce. Criminals flocked to these dark markets because the cryptocurrency was widely believed to be anonymous and untraceable. Sure, every transaction was immortalized on Bitcoin's blockchain, an unforgeable, unchangeable, and altogether public ledger. But that ledger recorded only which bitcoins resided at which bitcoin addresses, long, unique strings of letters and numbers at any given moment. In theory, at least, that meant buyers and sellers of illicit goods on opposite sides of the globe could send one another cash payments from behind the mask of those cryptic addresses without revealing any hint of their real-world identities. But just as cryptocurrency-based platforms like Alphabet opened up vast new global markets to criminals, they also opened up huge new opportunities for law enforcement, as Rabin quickly realized. The dark web presented him with the chance to work cases on a scale that would otherwise be impossible in Fresno. As long as a dark web drug dealer could be coaxed into sending a package to the Eastern District of California, the crime officially occurred in his jurisdiction. Rabin had no real idea how to pierce the veil of the blockchain's anonymity. But he figured that even dark web dealers must sometimes make mistakes that could be caught through traditional buy-and-bust police work. For an ambitious young prosecutor, the possibility was thrilling. "I wasn't necessarily happy with just prosecuting drug mules driving meth up the 99 freeway," he says. If he could arrange an undercover buy online and somehow identify the seller, he could arrest dealers all over the country. "All I have to do is order dope from them, and then we can go get them." And that's what we did. In 2014, Rabin began forming his dark web strike force, inviting local investigators from Fresno's Homeland Security Investigations and IRS Criminal Investigations offices to join. It was a small team of odd ducks, as he describes them, agents on the more cerebral side, content to work cases largely on a computer screen instead of kicking down doors like their Central Valley colleagues. By the time he recruited Robert Miller out of the D's wiretap room, Rabin's team had already achieved some success with their undercover approach. They'd started by cracking down on a few so-called peer-to-peer exchangers, individuals who bought and sold bitcoins in the real world and were often used by dark web dealers to cash out their dirty cryptocurrency. In several cases, they'd mine those exchangers' Rolodexes for leads on the legal names of dealers who'd done business with them, tracked them down, and arrested them. But Rabin had also begun to suspect that his original hunch was correct. Many of the dealers they targeted were indeed sloppy enough that agents could simply purchase drugs and look for clues either in their packaging or the vendors' online profiles. Miller, starting his new assignment, assembled the usernames of Alphabet's top dealers of heroin and the powerful synthetic opioid fentanyl, and he began to buy from them one by one. As the packages arrived, triple sealed in silver mylar and plastic, Miller and the team scrutinized both the shipments and their sellers' online presence. They found that one vendor had made an elementary mistake. he'd linked his PGP key, the unique file that allowed him to exchange encrypted messages with customers, with his email address on the PGP key server that stores a catalog of users' identities. Miller and Rabin quickly tied that email to the dealer's social media accounts and real name. They learned that he was based in New York. Miller then found fingerprints on a package of heroin sent from one of his accounts, which matched those of another New York man. Finally, Miller worked with postal inspectors to get photos taken by a post office self-service kiosk. The photos showed the second New Yorker putting a dope shipment in the mail. Miller and a team of agents flew across the country, searched the two men's homes, and arrested them both. The same simple PGP trick allowed Miller to find the real name of another dark web opiates dealer, which turned out to be part of his dark web handle, written backward, and caught him shipping dope, again using evidence from a post office kiosk camera. When agents raided the man's home in San Francisco, Miller says, they found piles of fentanyl and heroin powder sitting on tables and in open plastic containers. Rabin's team was now on a roll, building significant cases and even a reputation. When Miller ordered a package of opiates addressed to Fresno, he was amused when his San Francisco suspect warned him that a particularly aggressive group of feds operating out of the Central Valley seemed to be targeting players on the dark web and that he'd better watch his back. But Miller and Rabin didn't kid themselves. Busting a few of Alphaba's sloppier dealers wasn't any more likely to topple that black market than the idea was to defeat Mexican cartels by chasing yet another meth mule up Highway 99. By November 2016, Miller was ready to try something new again. He'd achieved a couple of decent dark web busts, but he didn't love the paperwork or the weeks spent in front of a screen. His shoulder and foot had finally recovered. Perhaps it wasn't too late to get onto the SWAT team after all. Then, one afternoon, Miller returned to the office after picking up lunch, his In-N-Out burger bag still in hand, to find an email from an intriguing stranger. The email explained that the sender had been Googling dark web arrests, looking for a law enforcement contact. They'd tried the FBI tip line, but no one had responded. They'd tried Homeland Security, no luck there either. Finally, they'd found Miller's contact information in one of the Fresno team's criminal indictments of an Alphaba drug dealer. So the stranger had decided to try getting in touch with Miller. And now they were ready to share a tip about who Alpha 02 might really be. Continued in Part 2, on the trail of a mastermind, a tip leads detectives to a suspect in Bangkok and to the daunting task of tracing his millions in cryptocurrency. This story is excerpted from the book Tracers in the Dark, The Global Hunt for the Crime Lords of Cryptocurrency, available November 15, 2022, from Doubleday. If you buy something using links in our stories, we may earn a commission. This helps support our journalism. Learn more. Chapter illustrations, Raimundo Perez 3. Photo source, Getty Images. This article appears in the November 2022 issue. Subscribe now. Let us know what you think about this article. Submit a letter to the editor at mail@wired.com. Story 4. The Lost Coast. 1976. There, on the horizon, a ship. Dave Strather * could see it through binoculars, the sails ghostly against the water. He was sitting on an exposed cliff overlooking the Pacific. It was dark, and the beach was deserted for 50 miles in both directions. This was the Lost Coast, a vast swath of rugged, uninhabited, magnificently forested Northern California, the kind of place that made you understand why people have always been drawn to the Golden State. Dave chose the spot for landfall precisely because it was so empty. He and his team needed secrecy. The sailboat was laden with contraband, 4,000 pounds of Thai stick pot, the latest in marijuana commerce, a product as potent as it was valuable, which Dave and his crew, a team of smugglers called the Coronado Company, would unload and sell for millions of dollars. Once Dave made visual contact, his team got on the radios. Offshore vessel, please identify. This is Red Robin. Finally. Smuggling always involves waiting, but Red Robin, the code name for a ship called the Painui, was months overdue, and Dave's nerves were frayed. The company, as its members called it, was already a successful and sophisticated operation, importing Mexican pot by the ton, hugging the coast in fishing boats from as far south as Sinaloa. But this was a new type of gig, crossing the Pacific in a double-mast ketch. There were more variables, more opportunities for error. The Painui had run out of gas before it even reached the international date line. Then, under sail, she was becalmed in the doldrums. And then she disappeared. "Red Robin, come in," Dave had said into his radio 1,000 times, in a daily attempt to reach the boat. He set up a radio watch, 500 feet above the ocean, for a better line of sight. The beauty of single sideband radio was that you could communicate halfway around the world, coordinating, as the company liked to do, with your fleet at designated hours on Zulu time. The problem with single sideband, besides that it wasn't secure, and anyone could listen, was that there wasn't much bandwidth. Dave and the others would eavesdrop on conversations in dozens of languages, hoping to hear the captain of the Painui. Back in September, it was pleasant to be perched on a palisade covered in redwoods, taking in the panoramic view, drinking a beer, tweaking the dial, watching the ocean go from silver to teal to green to blue in the late afternoon. By late December, however, everyone was cold and jumpy. But now, just before Christmas, their ship had finally come in. Dave and his team snapped into action. Everyone was practiced and drilled. That was the company's style. They were a tight, coordinated unit, most of them friends who grew up together in Coronado, a secluded little beach town on a peninsula off the coast of San Diego. A decade earlier, they had been classmates at Coronado High. Some of them were surfers and would bring small bales of pot across the border after surfing trips to Mexico. A half-decade later, the Coronado Company was the largest smuggling outfit on the West Coast, on its way to becoming a $100 million empire, one the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration would later call the most sophisticated operation of its kind. These kids were the best in the business, James Conklin, a retired DIA special agent, says about the group he tracked for years. They were ahead of their time. They operated almost like a military unit. The crux of the business was the offload. The battle was won or lost on the beach. Everyone had their role. Dave ran field strategy. Harlan Fincher, who had a knack for equipment, was the logistics manager. Al Sweeney, a hobbyist photographer and silk screener in high school, was the crack forger. Grease Monkey Don Kidd was the chief mechanic. Alan Logie, a one-time motorcycle racer, was the flamboyant wheelman. Ed Otero, a great swimmer and athlete, provided muscle. Bob Lahodney, a handsome charmer whose 22-carat bought chain signaled some mystical time spent in Thailand, had made the company's Asian supply connection. Lance Weber, who started the whole thing, was a fearless nut whom everyone called the Wizard on account of his thaumaturgical ways with engineering, especially the boat motors he rigged to run at smuggler speeds. At the center of it all was Lou Viller. A former Spanish teacher, Lou had taught some of the guys back at Coronado High. Lance originally brought Lou along for his language abilities. It helped that he was a smooth talker. But when he got a look at all that money, Lou discovered an instinct for business. He organized the company into a visionary outfit, with himself as the kingpin. It was Lance's idea to buy the DUKW, a 31-foot, six-wheeled, World War II era amphibious landing craft that served as the audacious centerpiece of the operation, allowing the company to drive right into the water and dock at sea with the sailboat. Lou had thought this was crazy. Oh sure, why not use Zeppelins, but after some research, Dave convinced Lou to approve the purchase of the 7.5-ton vehicle, which the crew had stashed in a barn near the tiny delta of Juan Creek. Dave directed the boat south of the creek, where the beach, as expected, was deserted. On the occasions when civilians wandered too close, they were intercepted by Dave, dressed as a park ranger, who told them that the area was the site of a wilderness reclamation project and off-limits to civilians. Lance went down the coast to Fort Bragg, 20 miles to the south, to get eyes on the local Coast Guard station. Company lookouts codenamed Nova for north and Saturn for south took position out on the Pacific Coast Highway. At midnight everyone radioed in with a round of affirmatives. The coast, as they say, was clear. "Let's get the duck rolling," Dave said over the COMM. With Ed and Don in the cockpit, the duck pulled out of the barn, drove down the Pacific Coast Highway to the beach, and nosed into the water. They'd welded an additional wave shield to the bow so the duck could break through the heavy California surf. Their compass turned out to be useless. But Ed, undaunted, plowed through the murky night 9 feet up a black cat's ass, as Don put it, to meet the waiting catch. They tied up, quickly transferred the load, and found their way back by aligning 2 lights Dave had set up on shore marking a safe passage. Heading back, he radioed Dave, who looked at his watch. "So far, so good." It was a funny thing to see the duck rise from the darkness, shedding seawater like a real-life nautilus until it stopped rising. By now the tide had gone out, and the duck, weighted down with tie product, sank in the soft sand. The tide wouldn't lift the vehicle for another 6 hours. By that time it would be broad daylight, and the duck would be as conspicuous as a relic on Omaha Beach. "Fuck," Dave said over the radio. "We're stuck." Ed hit the throttle and spun the wheels, sinking the duck deeper into the sand. "Kill the engine," someone yelled. Don got out, looked at the tires, and stood back. "Don't panic," he said. "I know exactly what to do." Don told Alan, who was on the beach, to get a couple of pickup trucks and a lot of rope. Like everyone else, he called the hirsute Alan Fuzzy. The 2 men were close, both a little wild, a couple of pranksters who got under Dave's skin. But by God, they knew how machines worked. Now they assembled an elaborate pulley system connecting the pickups to the duck's winch. "Are you sure this is gonna work?" Dave asked. Don didn't flinch when the motors fired, and sure enough his ad hoc Archimedean apparatus enabled the duck to lift itself out of the sand and back up to the road. It was a goddamn glorious sight. Cheers went up on the beach. Safely back in the barn, the company hands unloaded the duck's fragrant cargo. It was a sweet reward to sample the supply. Don thought the faintly purple buds were thick and beautiful, the finest he'd ever smoked. The cash was processed at the old general store next to the barn. It was the company's biggest haul to date, $8 million, about $33 million today. The company had stepped up its game, bringing in better product with more sophisticated technique. The distributors would be pleased. By now they had been waiting a long time, too. Back in his cabana at the Beverly Hills Hotel as the ringleader, he rarely set foot near the beach himself. Lou had had a hell of a time keeping them calm. He was worried that the company's reputation would be ruined if the supply didn't show. It was a relief to call the dealers and announce, "The Eagle has landed." The exchange with the dealers always happened fast. Like in the movies, the money would come in Halliburton briefcases. Unlike in the movies, the company usually waited to count it. And count it. And count it. And count it. It took so long to count that much cash, they got bored. When all was said and done, the partners each made $500,000 off the operation. For his rescue of the duck, Don got the MVP award, a new company institution, which came with a $25,000 bonus. Everyone else got their wad and scattered to the winds, the sweet scent of their trade wafting from their clothes. It was exhilarating, the money and the camaraderie. Company members saw themselves as hippie outlaws. There was no violence, they didn't even carry guns, just the threat of the law, which bound them together. They were criminals, but they were also a family. Afterward, Lou and Dave sat in Lou's cabana, going through receipts, looking at ledgers, accounting for a very good year. Later, they burned the receipts and went out to a Beverly Hills restaurant to celebrate. "Here's to everyone's efforts," Lou said as they hoisted champagne flutes. "Let's do it again soon." Asterisk not his real name. The teacher. 1964. Lou knew he wouldn't stop until he reached the Pacific. He had left New York in his convertible on that modern-day westward migration, a mid-century manifest destiny, with the top down and the red metal flake lacquer on his Corvette flashing in the sun. On the radio were Dick Dale and the Beach Boys, songs about girls, woodies, surfing. That's where he was headed. He was 25 and looking to change his life. Lou was born in Havana, Cuba, to a family of small business owners. His mother brought him to New York City as a teenager, in 1954, and he liked it, the hustle, the gritty determination required to get ahead. Lou was smart-mouthed and got into more fights than he should have for a guy his size. Despite being small, however, he was a great athlete, and he held his own in the rough and tumble of Flatbush, Brooklyn. After college, Lou studied law at Syracuse, but it was the early 1960s, and the California lifestyle was just dawning on America. Syracuse was awfully far from the beach, and when he heard about a job teaching Spanish at a high school in Coronado, he packed his bags. Coronado was all Lou had hoped for, an easygoing beach town of 18,000 people, known for its handsome Victorian hotel, Navy base, and isolation. It was a funny mix, a sort of military Mayberry. Coronado was connected to the mainland by an isthmus, but it took so long to drive around that it might as well have been an island out in San Diego Bay. Lou loved the nonchalance that came with the geography. Everyone called it the Rock, or, playfully, Idiot Island, a place where people did their own thing. At Coronado High, Lou quickly developed a strong rapport with the students. He was handsome and charming and cultivated a cool image. In addition to teaching Spanish, he coached swimming, water polo, and basketball. Lou liked to shoot hoops with his students after school. He was the kind of coach kids confided in. A lot of his students were Navy brats, raised in strict military families just as Vietnam was escalating. Lou had an ear for what the kids wanted to talk about. He was not much older than them, and he understood. Lou's father died when he was 3, and his own high school basketball coach had helped fill the role. He knew everything that a coach could be. "My boys," he called his players. But when the whistle blew, they knew it was time to work. Lou was a demanding coach, and his players loved him for it. Among Lou's Spanish students was Bob Lahodny, a popular kid with an easy smile, president of the class of '68 2 years in a row. Bob, a swim team star, was a close friend of Ed Otero's, class of '72, another strong swimmer on the team. Ed's nickname was Eddie the Otter, or sometimes just Otter. He was short and stocky, powerfully built, but he didn't like practice and was difficult to control. Lou liked Ed and thought he could have been a great competitive swimmer, but he had no discipline. Discipline was something you needed if you swam or played ball for Lou. He could be unforgiving even with his favorite players, like Harlan Fincher *, the star center of the basketball team. Harlan was tall and friendly. He'd been named Best Personality and Best Sense of Humor in his senior year, and he liked Lou's coaching. Lou thought the same of Harlan's playing, until the day Harlan snuck off with some friends and a bottle of Chivas after school and showed up dead drunk for the last game of the season. Furious, Lou took Harlan off the floor. "When you play for me," Lou told him, "you give me everything." He didn't speak to Harlan again for the rest of his time at Coronado High. The social scene in Coronado in those days was typical of its time: greasers, Letterman, and by the time Gidget was on television, surfers. The greasers wore black Converse, the Letterman wore white tennis shoes, and the surfers tended toward blue topsiders. Over time there were more and more topsiders as surfing took hold. Not far behind Gidget was the rest of the '60s, hair, rock and roll, and drugs. Coronado was fertile ground for the changing times, full of military kids eager to rebel. Alarmed by the influx of drugs, the city government set up a pilot project at the high school to keep students on the straight and narrow. It was called the No Bust Policy, and one of its counselors was Lou Viller. His approach was simpatico. He'd spent plenty of evenings in his kids' homes, watching disciplinarian fathers fume and military wives crawl on the floor after 3 martinis, and he sensed the hypocrisy. He knew the kids were just looking for an outlet and suggested alternatives. "Why smoke a joint," he'd ask, "when there are so many other ways to have fun in life?" It was persuasion over punishment, and Lou was nothing if not persuasive until he stopped believing the message. Lou had always been the bohemian teacher, the one who pulled into the faculty lot in a red Corvette and shades. When the school banned sunglasses, he wore his prescription Ray-Bans in class anyhow. For the students of Coronado High, this was a sign of solidarity. Lou was going through the same changes they were, reflecting a culture that was advancing at a frantic pace. Imagine starting high school in 1964, how fast it was all moving between freshman and senior year, from the Gulf of Tonkin to the Tet Offensive, from the Voting Rights Act to the Watts riots, from Help to the White Album. Like his students, Lou started growing his hair and learned to surf. It was humbling at first, eating salt water 1,000 times before he managed to get up on the board. But once Lou could feel the ocean lift him up and bring him to shore, he was hooked. There was energy in that ride. He started inviting his boys, and some girls, over for dinner. Together they all smoked their first joints. Everyone was scared, convinced they'd go crazy. Instead, smiles gradually spread around the room. They talked waves while the hi-fi played The Doors, whose front man, Jim Morrison, had lived in Coronado. Soon, Lou was counseling his kids against following in their parents' footsteps. "That's not a career," he would say, pointing at the ships moored off the Navy Yard. "That's a war machine." Lou thought it was pretty cool that one of his favorite Spanish students, Dave Strather, a talented musician, wanted to become a rock and roller. Lou started dating Kathy, a beautiful former cheerleader voted most popular the same year she was in the homecoming court, who had graduated from Coronado High a couple of years earlier. She was 7 years younger than Lou, but Lou himself was not yet 30. "We're just kids," he thought, "and the kids are finally in charge." It was just a matter of time before he quit teaching. Nobody wanted to be in the establishment anymore. In the summer of 1969, the summer of Woodstock, he traded his Corvette for a VW bus. During his last week in class, Lou brought in his turntable, wore his shades, and listened to Jethro Tull with his students. The bridge was going up that summer. You could see the caissons rising out of the bay, spelling the end of the rock as a de facto island. In August it opened to traffic. The 2-mile feet of box girder engineering arced gracefully across the bay, connecting Coronado to the rest of the world. The locals gathered on the Coronado side, waiting to watch those first cars roll across, knowing things would never be the same. The boys. 1969. Lance Weber was never cut out for the Navy. He had joined after graduating from Coronado High mostly so he wouldn't get shot at in Vietnam. His father, a Navy captain, wanted him to be an officer, but when Lance's service was up, his parents had to accept that he was just another washed-out swabby loafing around back on the rock. One thing the Navy did do for Lance, however, was teach him how to turn a wrench. After his stint as an engineer on a submarine, he could make anything work. Back in Coronado, he tricked out a VW microbus with a Porsche engine and built the island's first lowrider bicycle by hand. "Here comes the wizard," people would say, watching Lance cruise the beach on his tuned-up rig, barefoot, shirtless, his long blonde hair flowing behind him and a stone smile on his face. Easy Rider had just come out, and leaning back on 2 wheels was maybe the coolest thing you could do. When people said Lance was a space cadet, that meant they thought he was a rad fucking guy. That summer marked the first great marijuana supply shock in the United States, the consequence of booming stateside demand and a drought in Mexico. Prices spiked, encouraging creativity. There were mules caravanning the desert, planes flying low over the Arizona mountains, tires stuffed with green at the border. It was the dream of every pot smoker to get a block, or a kilo, keeping some and selling the rest. And for the stoned surfers on the beach in Coronado, there was an enormous arbitrage opportunity just a few miles south. The trick was figuring out how to get the stuff home. It was Lance who came up with the idea of taking to the water. At the Long Bar in Tijuana, he got his hands on 25 pounds of pot and swam it north from the beach by the bull ring of the Plaza Monumental de Tijuana. He washed up on the US side, on a beach with no name, no facilities, not even a parking lot, a perfect terminus for illegal night swims. He did it again, and again. It was dangerous, being in the water at night with only the blinking radio tower lights for guidance, but it was worth it. Each delivery netted $5,000. Soon, Lance had a little team of marijuana Marines working with him, swimming as many bundles as they could get their hands on. They were misfits, guys who couldn't get girlfriends in high school before Lance put pot and money in their hands, and now they looked to Lance as their eccentric leader. He got busted in 1971, but the few months he served in Lompoc made him Coronado's first hippie outlaw hero, a local legend. When Lance got back, Paul Acri, one of Lance's misfits, introduced him to a new connection, and they strapped on their fins again. A few bales later, however, they came up with a better idea, a Zodiac, similar to the inflatable rubber crafts used by Navy SEALs. One run in the Zodiac was good for 100 pounds of grass. It was easy money. Looking to expand the little operation, Paul brought in Ed Otero. Ed was the archetypal California boy, blonde, square face, cleft chin, like a letterman who had traded his varsity jacket for the waves. He was a former lifeguard, strong on land. He was known around town for tearing phone books in half and in the surf. They would call him the Otter for his facility in the water, his ability to break through nasty surf with bales in hand. A division of labor emerged. Paul arranged supply, Lance piloted the Zodiac, and Otter swam. The only thing holding them back was the connection, their guy in Tijuana. They called him Joe the Mexican, and since none of them had taken Lou's class, they couldn't understand a word Joe said. Lou was in dungarees, standing on a ladder with paintbrush in hand, when Lance rolled up on his lowrider bike. "You speak Spanish, right?" "Si," Lou said. Natural meant. It was a rhetorical question. "Then come down here," Lance said. "I got an idea." "I don't have time," Lou said. "I have to finish painting this house." "I'll make it worth your time," Lance said. He would pay Lou $50, he explained, to go with him to Tijuana for dinner. $50 sounded good to Lou. He was painting houses for money, living in a little cottage. Since quitting Coronado High, he had become a bona fide beachside Buddhist, surfing, reading Carlos Castaneda, pondering the evils of materialism, making candles, and meditating with a local guru named Beulah. He'd run into his old student, Bob Lahodny, among Beulah's disciples. He had also reconnected with Dave Struther, who had recently returned to Coronado after spending a few years as a studio musician in San Francisco. Life was simple, and Lou and Kathy were having a great time until free love got the best of them. After 4 years together they had split up, driven apart by jealousy. There was nothing wrong with their relationship other than timing. 1971 was a bad time to be young, good-looking, stoned, and married. Now Lou spent his days painting houses and his free time at the beach. That was where he met Lance, out on a jetty where people went to watch the sunset. Lance had gone to Coronado High but graduated before Lou's time. They started hanging out around the rock and roasted some pigs together. Luau's were the thing then. Lou loved that life. But he didn't love being so broke. Traveling down to Tijuana and translating for Lance was the easiest $50 he ever made until Lance offered him $100 the next week to do it again. During the second meeting, Lou sensed an opportunity for his friends and negotiated a larger load for a better price from Joe the Mexican. Impressed, Lance offered Lou a cut of the next shipment. When it was time for the pickup, Lou helped Lance, Paul, and Ed inflate the Zodiac and load it offshore by the little salt-eaten Rosarito Beach shack where Joe the Mexican delivered the goods. Once they got it across the border, Lou's share was $10,000. It was more money than he had earned in the past several years. He gave away his painting equipment and never looked back. Like everyone else, Lou had been smoking pot for giggles, but then came a moment of clarity, when he took that joint from behind his ear, sparked it up, and saw the future. The gig. 1972. Gigs, they called them. Or scams. Or barbecues, since they would plan them while throwing steaks on the grill at sundown. Everyone would get the call, "Do you want to go to a barbecue?" when it was time to mobilize. The missions were simple at first, with just the 12-foot Zodiac running a couple hundred pounds at a time from Rosarito to the Silver Strand Beach on Coronado's tiny isthmus. But the loads were getting bigger, and even Eddie the Otter had trouble hauling 50-pound bags through head-high waves. And everyone knew it was unwise seafaring, to say the least, to negotiate the coast in that little raft with no lights and no navigation. Still, Lance was an adventurer. He would have made a great swashbuckler, Lou always thought, or a test pilot. When Lance reached the Silver Strand, he'd signal with a flashlight and run the Zodiac right up onto the sand, burn up the motor. He'd say, "We'll buy a new one." They would offload the bags, deflate the boat, and pack it all into the van. It would be over in 5 minutes, the most exciting 5 minutes they'd ever experienced, everyone holding their breath until the van was on the road, knowing as they drove away that they each had just made twice their parents' annual salary. At first there was 1 gig a month. Then it was 1 a week. Within a year, the crew was scaling up from the Zodiacs to a clandestine armada of speedboats, fishing boats, even a 40-foot cabin cruiser. Some of the money they made went back into the business. Lance bought a Chris Craft called the Lee Max 2 and rebuilt the engine so he could carry serious weight at top speeds. They hired beach crews to expedite the offload. It was risky, bringing more people into the operation, but it was Coronado, and everyone knew each other. "If we take care of them," Lance said, "they'll take care of us." And the partners could afford to be generous. Still in their 20s, they were walking around with $50,000 in their pockets, then $100,000, then $250,000. "Don't you love it?" Lance once remarked, "when life goes from black and white to technicolor." Lou walked into a bank, asked for the balance of his mother's house, and paid it off in cash. Once, when he was buying first-class tickets to Hawaii for himself and his girlfriend, it dawned on him that he had enough money to hang out there and surf for the rest of his life. And he might have, had Ed and Lance not flown over personally to retrieve their partner. "Come on, Senor Viller," Ed said. "There's more money to be made." It got to be like clockwork, enough so that sometimes Lance's and Lou's girlfriends would tag along on the supply runs to Tijuana. It was about this time that Lance started calling Lou Pops, a nickname that caught on. "What do you think, Pops?" Lance asked one evening, drinking Coronas on the beach in Baja. "I think we got a good thing going here," Lou said. "Let's not fuck it up." The Agency. 1973. When the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration opened its office in the San Diego suburb of National City in 1973, it had just 6 field agents. The DEA was a brand new agency, assembled from various other departments, including the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, BNDD, a tautologically titled bureaucratic relic that was poorly equipped to fight the war on drugs that President Richard Nixon had declared in 1971. The impetus for the drug war was a congressional report issued the same year stating that as much as 15% of U.S. soldiers serving in Vietnam, a conflict that put hundreds of thousands of Americans in close proximity to the Golden Triangle, had come back hooked on heroin. The same report said that half of the service smoked pot. Alongside other law enforcement agencies like the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and the FBI, the DEA was tasked with fighting what Nixon called the new menace. Bobby Dunn was one of the first agents working out of the new office. He'd started his law enforcement career in National City a dozen years earlier, as an animal control officer. After working his way up through the ranks of the local police department, he'd become a federal narcotics agent in 1968 and spent several years working in Guadalajara, Mexico. Dunn was excited to be abroad but quickly realized that corruption in Mexico made his job nearly impossible. When he came back to the States, he asked to join the DEA's San Diego office, because the action, as they called it, was at the border. The new agency needed all the local savvy it could get. San Diego was a world apart from drug interdiction on the East Coast, where well-understood organized crime syndicates brought heroin in through the ports. California was a new front, the Wild West. Newly arrived agents couldn't believe it. In one 12-hour shift at San Isidro, you'd get 3 or 4 hauls of 100 kilos. Dunn was the first officer to pull a full ton of pot out of a truck heading north. Dunn was a field agent, and in San Diego the work lived up to the title. In other DEA offices, you went to work in a suit and tie and spent a lot of time at your desk. In San Diego, the agents were veterans of border details and dressed like vaqueros, boots, jeans, guayaberas, cowboy hats. They spoke Spanish, wore beards and mustaches, and spent the nights in Tijuana bars with informants and local cops. To get anywhere, you had to roll up your sleeves and go drinking down in Revolucion, getting to know the people on both sides of the border trade. None of that shoe leather work, however, clued the DEA into the new homegrown smuggling organization right under their noses, on the other side of San Diego Bay. The DEA's first tip about the company came from a Coronado police officer who had heard through the grapevine about some local guys and a former teacher running bales of pot up the coast. The beach runs weren't in Coronado proper and were beyond police jurisdiction, so the officer called the feds. Dunn was intrigued. He was assigned to a special unit that worked closely with local police and other law enforcement, and he debriefed the Coronado officer. He arranged for the Coast Guard to run some exercises with Zodiacs and realized that the small crafts could cruise the coast without showing up on radar. Very clever, he thought. Then the DEA got wind of a boat called the Limax II, owned by a local kid named Lance Weber who had done time in Lompoc a couple years before for smuggling. There were reports of the Limax II on the water at 3 a.m., and Dunn doubted they were out fishing. Once, following a late-night sighting of Lance's boat, the DEA posted agents at regular intervals along the coast, hoping to catch the smugglers in action. They saw the boat motoring away from a lonely stretch of beach in Carlsbad, north of San Diego. Dunn and the other agents rushed to the scene and scoured the beach, but it was too late. All they found were footprints going up the dunes to a house overlooking the ocean. Professionals. 1974. Lately, Lou had been spending more time in North County. There was money up there, in Carlsbad, where he rented a house, and knew hot spots like Del Mar and La Costa. One night, Lou met the owner of the Albatross, a nice seafood restaurant housed in an old church in Del Mar. He thought the place was groovy, good food, drinks, and music, and well attended by rich dopers. The owner of the restaurant was a big-time distributor himself. Lou had come to recognize that smuggling was as much about personality as it was about know-how. To climb the ladder, you had to play it cool. Which is what he and the restaurant owner did, warily revealing their mutual interest, pulling their cards away from their vests to talk about how they might fit into each other's business models. "How much can you handle?" Lou asked. "How much can you bring?" the owner replied. The Albatross crowd offered Lou entree to a new class of distributors, the kind of dealers who dressed well and belonged to racket clubs. Lou began joining them for dinner, talking books, travel, and wine. They turned Lou onto a wine importer up in San Francisco, and he started ordering Bordeaux and white Burgundies. Refinement suited him. By now he had cut his hair and traded his hippie beads for silk shirts. When Lou suggested bringing in a ton, and the dealers said they'd pay cash on the barrelhead, he saw the horizon expanding before his eyes. Lance delighted in the prospect of expanding their little navy. But carrying more weight meant more people on the beach. 5-10 guys running bags up and down the sand, and they needed to tighten the screws on the organization. Lou started strategizing. He turned to his good friend and former student Dave Struther. Dave's band was still playing around town, and he had recently married a tall, good-looking hippie girl named Linda. But Lou knew he was struggling financially. "Are you interested in some profitable moonlighting?" Lou asked him one day. Dave, a solid-body surfer, handled himself well in the waves and started as a loader. But he was a gifted planner, and it wasn't long before Lou gave him more managerial duties. Lou wanted a right-hand man, and Dave was a natural. He was a drummer, after all, used to keeping time, being the backbone. Even in his hippie days he was fastidious, shampooing his long hair every day, and belying his nickname, Dirty Dave. That hair was gone once Dave started running around with a clipboard and checklists, buying and storing equipment, running smuggling gigs like a stevedore superintendent. That put Dave at odds with Ed, whose run-and-gun style had been central to the early days of the operation but was fast becoming obsolete. Ed was a beloved figure around Coronado, a fun guy, the life of every party. But he was impulsive. When Ed was a lifeguard, he liked to drive his truck down the sand at full speed, and that's how he'd flipped it right into the water. Dave bristled when he would show up at a gig at the last minute and start bossing people around, imperiling Dave's meticulous plans. Dave would appeal to Lou, who tried to promote Ed out of Dave's hair. "You don't want to be a grunt on the beach," he told him. "You're in management. Let Dave roll up his sleeves." That mostly worked, at least at the smuggling sites. Off the beach was another matter. Ed was young, wild, and flush, a dangerous combination in a small town. Here he was, no known job, celebrating one of the organization's first big paydays at the chart house down on the Embarcadero, cozying up to some girl with his hands full of cash. "Look what I got, baby," Ed told her, laying out 10 grand in bills. Lou would have jumped on the table to cover it up, but the whole place had seen it already. "We need to cut these shenanigans," Lou told his colleagues. "We're gonna bring heat on ourselves." What he didn't know was that they already had. The dia was onto Lance, watching him run the Lee Max 2 like a daredevil, at full speed on autopilot, ripping through the swells like a lunatic. And Lance was as flamboyant on land as he was cavalier in the cockpit. He knew he was known to the authorities, and he loved pushing his luck. "I like making the cops look bad," he'd say. "It's fun." Not to Lou, it wasn't. One night after a gig in Carlsbad, they'd planned to meet at a coffee shop near Oceanside Harbor after the beach crew unloaded the shipment. Lou was sitting in his booth with a fork in a slice of cherry pie when he looked up and saw Lance drive past in his truck, pulling the Lee Max 2 on its trailer, 2 squad cars in tow. The cops tore the boat apart, right in front of the coffee shop, but found nothing. Lance relished his little victory and then walked in to meet Lou. "Don't even talk to me," Lou said, jumping up to leave. "Just keep walking." It was the same night Special Agent Dunn found footsteps on the beach near Lou's house. The DIA agents had followed Lance in his boat to the marina, but when the boat came out clean, the district attorney refused the DIA a search warrant for the house. It was a close call. Lou didn't realize how close when he moved to Solana Beach and relocated the entire smuggling outfit out of Coronado. It was the first time some of its members had lived anywhere besides the Rock. By then, everyone on the island knew what they were up to. They even had a name for their hometown smugglers, the Coronado Company. The name stuck. Lou had misgivings about it, but it suited the group's professional aspirations. By now they were evolving quickly. Lou turned out to be not just a natural leader, but also an organizational genius. The one-time anti-materialist candle maker became a business visionary, laying out plans for the company to dominate its market niche. As he had when he was a coach, Lou knew how to motivate people, establish mutual trust, and make the members of his squad believe in their abilities. Pops was now a father figure to a new kind of team. It was fun in those early days, he told his boys in the company, but amateur hour is over. The new organization left little room for Paul Acree. Paul was always his own worst enemy. He was cold and had a nasty gift of gab. He could be funny, but always at the expense of others. Paul had found the crew's original line of supply in Tijuana, but Lou knew he wasn't the right guy to make the bigger connections the operation needed to grow. You couldn't look like a hood at the next level. His idea of business, give me the money, you get the pot, was oafish. Where was the salesmanship in that? Where was the finesse? And lately, Paul had started sniffling and rubbing his nose. Nobody knew when exactly he had become an addict. Maybe it was when everyone got rich and he could suddenly get as much heroin and coke as he wanted. Once driven, he was coasting now, showing up at meetings with watery eyes. He looked terrible. He was Lance's friend, but even Lance knew that you couldn't trust a junkie. When the company convened to vote Paul out, it was unanimous. One of the company's Mexican contacts, known as Pepe de Mexicali, had told Lou about the time he had to get rid of an associate who had been caught with his fingers in the jar by taking him on a one-way plane ride. The Coronado company's style was more genteel than that. If you got fired, they just stopped calling you. With Paul, the partners decided, they would simply move away. They left him with $10,000. It wasn't much in the way of hush money, especially for a guy who was speedballing, but that was the offer. With Paul gone, Lou took on an even larger role within the company, and he started to act the part. He conducted business from his new house in Solana Beach, on a cliff overlooking the ocean, with his Malamute, Prince, at his feet. There he'd preside with his girlfriend, Carrie Kavanagh, a waitress he'd met at another Tony spot in nearby Cardiff by the sea. Lou had left her a $100 tip one night, followed the next day by 20 dozen roses, along with a card bearing a poem he wrote. Carrie thought the roses were a bit tacky. A nice little bouquet of hand-picked wildflowers would have better suited a girl like her, but the poem was nice. She showed up at Lou's house, where she found him sunbathing on the deck. Lou had spent a few years floating between girls, but he saw immediately that Carrie had a spark. She was smart, with a bright smile and an eager outlook on the world. Lou was older, wealthier, and more worldly than the boys who hit on her on the beach. He doted on her, gave her gifts and several cars, paid for her dance classes. Soon she moved from her beach trailer into Lou's place. They would entertain the rest of the company guys and their girlfriends there, drinking Greyhounds until dinner and then smoking and doing lines while dancing to the average white band until 3 in the morning. The next day, they'd wake up and start all over again. Lou initially told Carrie he was an interior decorator, but she didn't believe it for long. His place was well decorated, but she never saw a single catalog or bolt of fabric around. It wasn't a surprise when Lou finally confessed that he was a drug kingpin, nor did it change how she felt about him. Carrie was the kind of girl who watched the Watergate hearings from beginning to end. With her anti-establishment sympathies, Lou's profession had a renegade appeal. For his part, Lou saw himself as a new kind of CEO. He just wanted to excel at what he did. He was already a multimillionaire, as were his partners. They thought that was all the money in the world. They were wrong. The Dawn. 1975. Lou and Dave were south of the border, in a Tijuana flophouse near the racetrack, surrounded by a dozen men with machine guns. They were drug lord foot soldiers, you could tell from the chrome-plated pistols in their belts. No one moved. Dave and Lou waited. The seconds felt like hours. They had gotten themselves into this situation on purpose, after deciding that the company should do some supply chain outreach. Dave had run across a guy they called Rick Pick who said he knew Roberto Beltran, the Don, the head of the Sinaloa-based trafficking syndicate, one of the biggest drug dealers in the world. Lou and Rick met and sized each other up. Once they decided that they trusted each other, Lou said, "Introduce me to the Don." Thus began a series of false starts and frustrations. Late at night, Lou and Dave would get a call and rush to the appointed meeting place under the San Diego side of the Coronado Bridge, only to find nobody there. Finally, when the real call came to meet in Tijuana, Lou arrived 2 hours late on purpose. That's the Mexican style of business, he thought. Mañana. Keeping them waiting, Lou reasoned, would show that they were equals. But now, trapped deep inside the syndicate's flophouse, they knew they were not equals. And Beltran's guys didn't look happy. Dave was terrified. But Lou kept his game face. He was still wondering if the meeting was for real. "Are we going to see the Don?" he asked. Finally, the Don's bodyguard, who went by the name El Guapo, led them into a small room. There, reclining on a king-size bed, was Beltran. Dave and Lou were surprised to see that the Don looked like a Maharishi, or maybe a bum, scraggly hair, jeans, unshaven. When they walked in, he didn't get up. It was a weird scene, standing at the foot of the bed, unsure of what to do. Dave thought they were dead. Especially when Lou decided to take a pillow and lay down on the bed, right next to Beltran. Dave silently said a prayer. One of the things Dave liked about Lou was his finesse. Dave's own father was the executive officer of the Navy base on Coronado, a tyrant whose explosive temper kept him from ever becoming an admiral. He had trouble forming real relationships with anyone, including his son. Dave hated his father, and he admired Lou for being the opposite in every way. Dave thought he had an aristocratic bearing, an elegance that could charm people in any situation. But this situation was different. This was Roberto Beltran. And he wasn't smiling. Lou and the Don were chatting softly, faces inches apart. Within a few minutes, Beltran was grinning, then laughing. Lou's instinct was right, the Don respected the wildly daring initiative of showing up like this, offering a new service to the syndicate. No one from the States had ever approached him. "What do you have to lose?" Lou told him. Lou knew the Mexicans were sending half-tons north every way they could think of and losing a lot of it at the border. It was a model that made money, the supply that got through paid for the rest, but still, there was a lot of smuggler shrinkage. This is what Lou told Beltran, in so many words, the Coronado Company can reduce your shrinkage. "Let's do business," the Don said. The days of cabin cruisers were over. Lance hired a commercial fishing vessel and a sailor of fortune who went by the name Charlie Tuna. The boat arrived for pickup at an isolated beach on the Sea of Cortez. Beltran's bodyguard drove Dave and Lou. They were rumbling along the barely paved highway in the shadow of the Sierra Madre Occidental when they saw roadblocks flanked by soldiers on the road. The jig is up, Dave thought, but their caravan was waved right through. The men were from the Don's security team, part of his service package as a supplier. Federals on the Don's payroll guarded the beach operation. Out on the water, Charlie Tuna maneuvered his boat through the beach mud, getting as close to shore as possible. The boat was loaded with hundreds of bales, passed from sand to canoe to Zodiac to deck, along with some cases of beer for the crew's return trip. "See you in Malibu," Charlie said over the radio. On shore, Lou shook hands with the Don. The whole deal was on credit. And now the company owed the Sinaloa suppliers $3 million. It had never occurred to Lou what might happen if something went wrong. "Good luck," Beltran told Lou. "You've got some real cojones, you know." 15 tons, Dave thought, right on the goddamned beach. The Mexican job was an enormously challenging offload, an order of magnitude bigger than their usual runs. Dave bought more sophisticated equipment and procured several houses to use as staging sites and covered entrepôts, including a rental right off the Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu. That was where the team assembled. The company had added some new recruits, including Alan Fuzzy Logie, a surfer turned motorcycle racer. Fuzzy was amazed at the scale of the company's operation and quickly took a liking to Don Kidd, another trafficking tenderfoot recruited by Lance. Don hailed from Coronado. Lou had taught his brother Spanish and he would have been class of '69 if he had graduated instead of going to Vietnam. The company had brought Don on as a gopher, but he quickly distinguished himself as a talented mechanic whose expertise would eventually elevate him to chief engineer. The midnight chaos reminded Don of Vietnam, exciting but perilous. They were in plain view of the neighbors, whose lights were on. And they were out there on the water for hours, buzzing around in the zodiacs, carrying everything by hand. Luckily, it was overcast, and the reflected glow of the city gave them extra light. They got the job done, but it took forever. Fuzzy ran for 8 hours straight. In the end, they managed to fit all 15 tons in 3 rented rider trucks. The next stop was the processing site. As the convoy pulled away from the beach, they drove right past a highway patrol cruiser on the shoulder with lights flashing. Fuzzy smiled as they passed. The officer was writing some poor bastard a speeding ticket while a truck packed with thousands of pounds of pot sailed by at 60 miles an hour. At the warehouse, where Dave had organized an assembly line style repackaging system, every brick was weighed to the gram, bagged, marked with a sticker, and recorded. Lou showed up to inspect the wares. It was a job well done. When everyone got their cut, Fuzzy asked if he could get paid in weed. He had to settle for cash instead. Well, he told the others, I hope I get invited to another barbecue. Lou, intent on impressing the Don, decided to deliver his money immediately, in person, without being asked. When Lou and Dave flew to Culiacan, Sinaloa, and, once again surrounded by machine guns, handed over duffel bags containing $3 million in cash, they had carried them on the plane and snuck through customs with swiped inspection tags. The Don smiled. We owe you a party, he said. That night, he feted them at a restaurant in Culiacan, where he and Lou arranged the next consignment, another 20 tons. When they got the shipment into the safety of a warehouse in Santa Cruz, the load was 10 feet high. Ed pulled out some blocks and arranged them into a chair, and they all took turns sitting on the throne of hard-packed kilos. The Coronado Company were now the biggest pot smugglers on the West Coast. What they had done, at their age, Lou, the oldest among them, was just 34, and most of the rest were in their mid-20s, was without precedent. They were a bunch of young hippies sitting atop an empire. The Insider. 1976. People around Coronado told different stories about how exactly it was that Paul wound up talking to the DIA. Some said he just wanted to get back at the company. Others said he was arrested trying to steal some navigation gear and, jonesing in jail, made a deal. Whichever it was, the moment Paul started talking was the moment that Dunn and the other agents discovered just what they were up against. They were shocked at the company's scale. As far as they knew, smuggling on the West Coast was a haphazard business. And here was Paul telling them how the company was landing thousands of kilos on a beach with seal-like precision not 3 miles from their office. They were operating at a level far beyond the DIA itself. The agency's national city office, only a few years old, barely had the budget and personnel to cover San Diego County, much less go toe-to-toe with an organization like the company. Paul, meanwhile, had nothing to lose. His money was gone, but his drug habit wasn't. All he had left was information. Paul might have been excommunicated from the company, but he was still connected to Lance. Although Lance had moved away from Coronado with the rest of the partners, his girlfriend, Celeste, still lived on the rock. When he was in town, he hung around with the old crowd, even Paul. Sensing opportunity, Dunn let Paul go, sending him out to gather more information. Coronado was a natural rumor mill, and word got around quickly that Paul was snitching. But Lance was a chatterbox, and he couldn't help himself from filling in Paul on the company's latest exploits anyway. Back in the DIA office, a picture began to come together. The agents heard about the organization's humble beginnings, the deal with Roberto Beltran that pushed the company into the big time, and, the following year, a trip to Morocco. That gig started with a meeting at a Black Angus steakhouse in La Mesa and took them to the Canary Islands, Casablanca, and Tangiers. The idea had come from the younger brother of Lou's ex-wife, Kathy. He had done some frontier surfing on the edge of the Sahara, the scene of some legendary perfect right breaks, and came back talking about hashish, the potent black tar of the Berbers. The company found a new captain, Charlie Tuna's friend, who, no joke, went by the name Danny Tuna, and a new ship, a 70-footer rigged for albacore fishing called the Finback. There were bumps along the way, like Danny running out of money and trying to sell his equipment to confused dockside Canary Islanders. Lance and Ed flew to Tenerife, where they found Danny, drunk, lost, and carousing with British girls on holiday. They got the Finback to Algeciras, at the Strait of Gibraltar, resupplied, and then steamed back in rough weather across the Atlantic and Caribbean. It turned out that the Finback's cargo wasn't actually hash but rather keef, a less valuable precursor product. But the DIA agents understood the operational significance of the mission. These guys had crossed oceans and solved major logistical problems on the fly. No one in the office had ever seen anything like it. It had been years since Lou had seen Bob Lahodny. Since the two crossed paths as earnest disciples of the meditation guru Beulah on the beach in Coronado, the one-time class president and swim champ had gone abroad. He'd bought the Pai Nui, a handsome, teak-deck sailboat, and sailed around the South Pacific. He was in Bali when he fell in with the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. Like-minded expatriates from Southern California, the Laguna Beach-based group was known for proselytizing about the benefits of LSD. They were close associates of Timothy Leary and had once worked with the Weather Underground to help him flee the United States. They also ran a vast drug smuggling network, manufacturing and distributing acid in the United States and running hashish from Kandahar, Afghanistan. The Brotherhood had connections in Thailand, too, and Bob brought them back to Coronado. "You guys can make the same money from 2 tons of Thai stick as 20 tons of Mexican pot," Bob told his old pal Ed when he reappeared in the States. Thai stick had enjoyed an aura of mystique ever since U.S. soldiers started coming back from Vietnam tours with batches of the extremely powerful varietal knotted around bamboo skewers. It had developed a reputation as the new marijuana gold standard, one-hit shit, they called it. The DIA at the time believed it to be among the most profitable commodities in existence. A ton bought in Bangkok for $100,000 went for $3.5 million stateside. The hard part was getting it there. Unlike drugs flowing north from Latin America, Thai stick had to come in by boat. And boats happened to be the company's specialty. Bob came on as a partner, bringing in his connections but steering clear of the operation. He was, in Lou's words, a good-time Charlie rather than a brass-tacks guy. Still, the first shipment he brought back aboard that Pai Nui was a multimillion-dollar proof of concept of how Thai stick would revolutionize the company. When Dave did the math, his eyes widened. The company could earn more, far more, while being more discreet. It was a smuggler's dream. By now, the company had earned a begrudging respect from its pursuers. The DIA agents in National City regarded Lou and his crew as smart businessmen and tactical geniuses. But Dunn had an idea about how to tighten the screws on their investigation. A veteran agent, he was one of the few people in his office who knew how to write up a conspiracy case. The tactic was mostly unknown in the DIA at the time, but it was a legal tool that would allow for deeper investigative powers and bigger indictments. Once Dunn and the other agents learned the full magnitude of the company's activities, they started laying the groundwork for the case. Using the information that Paul had fed them, the agents began piecing together the facts of a conspiracy. By the spring of 1976, as the company was contemplating its leap into the Thai trade, Dunn had enough to convince the U.S. Attorney in San Diego to convene a grand jury. Now the D's investigation had a name. Operation CORCO was in full swing. Freeway all the way. 1977. You nearly clipped Bambi. Fuzzy pulled up alongside Dave in fourth gear. They were straddling a pair of enduros, off-road motorcycles they'd brought up to the Redwoods, where Fuzzy was teaching Dave how to ride. Dave was getting the hang of it, opening up the throttle on the open forest roads, taking in the hum and rattle and the prismatic sun filtering through the canopy. He hadn't noticed a spotted fawn grazing on the shoulder. Fuzzy saw Dave's tire brush its bushy white tail. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, grinning. The two had been up there for weeks, cruising the backcountry of the Lost Coast, looking for even more remote loading sites after the success of the Painui. Finding the right spot was an art. Dave constantly studied maps, scoping out prospective landing sites as far north as Alaska. But the empty beaches of the Lost Coast, many of them accessible only by old unpaved logging trails, had the advantage of being conveniently close to San Francisco. The nimble, long-range enduros, their reach extended by gas cans stashed in the woods, were the best way to negotiate the difficult terrain of one of the country's most beautiful landscapes. The whole territory was a refuge of dropouts and outlaws, Hells Angels, ex-cons, hippie communes. But the forest was vast enough to swallow all of them, and Dave and Fuzzy would be alone with the trees for hours. One day, they bumped their way down a road that followed the coastal bluffs of the Sinkyone wilderness to a small cove. They stopped their bikes, scanning the terrain from above. The cove faced south and kept the roiling Pacific at bay. There was a nice break, but Fuzzy knew there'd be no time for surfing. Dave looked at the map. The cove was marked as Bear Harbor. In the late 19th century it had been used for loading lumber onto ships, but the wharf was long gone. "This is just what we're looking for," Dave said. Sometimes Lou's story was that he was a trust funder. Sometimes he was the son of a Texas wildcatter. Once he was mistaken for a member of KISS, and he let that story linger. Whoever he was, Lou owned it. "I'm in oil," he'd say. "And if you ask any more questions, I'll ask you to leave." If you wore money well, Lou thought, you could be whoever you wanted. You could live for months at a time at the Beverly Hills Hotel or the Waldorf Astoria in New York, paying $1,500 a night in cash. Maybe you were a movie producer or a chief surgeon somewhere. No one asked questions, the money made you invisible. Lou made the drug business look like any other business. He would rendezvous with his distributors on tennis courts in Palm Springs, meet in the open, change from a coat and tie into tennis whites, let the other guy win the set, shake hands, and make the deal. There were no rough edges. Nobody in the company wanted to be a gangster. They wanted to fit in, to live the good life. Lou had long since traded his VW bus for a Ferrari. In the trunk, he carried a valise full of fun tickets, $100 bills to satisfy any whim. He and Ed and Bob bought palatial homes, acquired a taste for antiques. Bob and Ed, who had climbed Machu Picchu together, added Mesoamerican touches to their Asian aesthetic. Lou's tastes ran toward the eclectic. Among other things, he had bought a carved opium bed from China. He would jet to Paris on the Concorde and spend the weekend buying $5,000 worth of shoes. He spent $15,000 on a fake passport under the name Peter Grant, bought a Mercedes as James Benson, shopped at Wilkes-Bashford as Richard Malone. This was the name Lou was known by in La Costa and in Lake Tahoe, where the company liked to vacation. One day, Lou surprised Carrie with tickets to Jamaica, where they lived for a month on a remote lagoon, disconnected from everything, just snorkeling and reading. It was there, at Dragon Bay, that Carrie discovered that she was falling in love with him. In 1976, Lou had bought a place in Tahoe for himself and Carrie. Dave and Linda moved there as well, to a condo nearby. Dave felt like he was coming into his own in the company. Lou trusted Dave's judgment without question, and Dave respected the vision that had gotten them this far. He treated Lou like an adoptive father, and Lou, who had no kids of his own, treated Dave like a favored son. Dave still wasn't a partner, but he had moved beyond beachmaster to something like a general manager, with final word on operational decisions. Tahoe became a refuge for the company, a place where the couples hung out together and received a steady stream of guests. Lou bought a beautiful vintage Chris Craft boat called the Rich and Dirty for water skiing, and he'd spend all day blasting Fleetwood Mac's Rumors on the 8-track while Carrie carved a slalom wake behind him. At night, Carrie would fish for deep-water Mackinaw trout and stuff it whole for dinner. Carrie had grown close to Bob and loved how Ed lived big and laughed all the time. The same style that had caused problems on the beach made Ed the life of the party, the kind of guy who'd walk into a room bellowing, clapping along as Dave and Bob played stone duets on the piano. Sometimes they'd invite their investors to the lake, guys Lou brought in to spread the risk. Lou was good at intuiting potential partners. Some of them were already trade insiders, but others were straight, bond brokers and lawyers and other pedigreed people who couldn't resist the 2 or sometimes 3-to-1 return Lou was offering. The company had its own accountant, buying properties on its behalf, creating shell companies with names like Mo Ching Trading Co., Toto Limited, and Ku1 Investment Co., Ltd. Another frequent guest in Lake Tahoe was Phil DeMassa, a San Diego area criminal defense attorney. Lou had met DeMassa a few years earlier, at one of the birthday bashes Ed liked to throw for himself. DeMassa was known in the drug trade as a high-priced but effective attorney. He was a litigator who liked the fight, worked long hours, and was successful at keeping the government at bay. Lou wanted that kind of firepower and gave DeMassa $300,000 in cash to come aboard. "Just don't deal in anything white," DeMassa advised Lou, "and he'd take care of the rest." There, above the electric blue lake, a thought dawned on Lou: money is energy. A frictionless medium for amplifying your will. Once, Lou asked Carrie to come and stand with him in front of $2 million that he had arranged in $10,000 stacks. "Can't you feel it?" he said, looking at the bundles. With the cash it had on hand, the company could do whatever its principals dreamt up by the road, as Ed liked to put it. On a practical level, that was Ed's job. His rough style turned out to be good for the dirty work required to run a multinational criminal enterprise, paying off local officials, buying boats in seedy foreign ports, vetting sellers abroad. Others thought those assignments were dangerous, but Ed saw them as adventures. His passport under the name Kenneth Eugene Cook, Jr. filled with stamps from India, Switzerland, Hong Kong, Senegal, the Seychelles, and the Panama Canal Zone. Expansion plans were underway closer to home, too. Word from buyers was that the East Coast was dying for smoke. Switching geography, the company figured, would help throw off the heat, too. Dave had studied his maps and praised the gods of fractal geometry for giving distant Maine as many miles of coast as California. He purchased a beach house on Denison Point in Cutler, overlooking Little Machias Bay, an equipment house outside the small town of Freedom, and a communication house near Skowgan. Across the globe, Ed attended to the maritime details, cargo ship certifications, port clearances, tonnage certificates. Soon the shipment, 7 tons of tie stick, was on the move. By now the company had perfected a cell structure, flexible but tightly organized, bonded by friendship and mutual trust. Company guys lived around the country, under assumed names, and communicated by 800 numbers with answering services, where they'd leave coded messages with callback numbers to pay phones. Everyone always had a bag of quarters. Dave was an early adopter of beepers and used techniques from a class at the Bornstein School of Memory Training to encrypt key numbers onto a chart that crew members could stick to the backs of their watches. You'd get a message Burma Christmas and know who to call back. With this system the company could disappear for months at a time and then re-emerge at the ready. Heading up the main operation with Dave was Harlan Fincher, the Coronado High basketball team's former center. Harlan had gone off to school on an athletic scholarship and then returned to Coronado to work as a printer. Since his drunken appearance at the last game of his varsity career, Harlan hadn't heard from Lou until, one day at work, he received a call out of the blue. "Hi, Harlan," a familiar voice said. "Long time." It was Harlan's job to transform into reality the elaborate schemes that Dave had dreamed up for the main operation. The project had many technical hurdles. The house on Denison Point sat near the edge of a cliff, looking out over the waters where the first naval battle of the American Revolution was fought. The beach below the cliff was a serious bone patch, rocks everywhere, some the size of VWs, and the tides were huge and fast changing. This wasn't like back home in Coronado, with 300 yards of flat sand. It was Don who came up with the solution, installing a yarder, a 5-ton piece of industrial logging equipment, in the house's garage. The yarder would lower trucks by cable straight down the face of the cliff so they could negotiate the rocks out to the dock the company had built at the water's edge. The trucks would be loaded and driven back to the palisade, then winched back up the cliff face and into the garage. It was outrageous but clever, an improvised mechanical marvel. The rest of the gear was stored in a 19th century barn, beneath a giant sleigh of similar vintage hanging in the rafters. For months the team worked there, tending to mission preparations. Fuzzy tested the outboards and doused the spark plug cylinders in starting fluid. You didn't want to be out there in the dark pulling cords. He altered the gravity feeds Dave had bought to move the bales, using his arc welder to make them adjustable. Elsewhere in the barn were the new Maravillas, 35-foot-long Kevlar barges they had bought for towing the pot back from the mothership. Dave had them custom-made. He told the Maravilla sales agent that they would be used to transport cattle across the Rhine. Where Dave came up with that, he didn't know. It was the kind of cover story that just rolled off his tongue by now, the instinctive cloak and dagger of a life built on anonymous P.O. boxes and money orders and answering services and forged identities. The fake IDs were Al Sweeney's department. Dave brought him in because he remembered from high school that Al could point a camera and print well. Al was the science club type, quiet, smart, focused. He'd meet with company guys at the San Francisco Hyatt, carrying a turquoise garment bag that doubled as the backdrop for the California ID photo, which he could reproduce within 48 hours. Even after the DMV instituted a new band of invisible ink, a supposedly unbreakable security measure, Al figured out how to duplicate it. In addition to being the company's master forger, Al had been a ham radio hobbyist in high school, and with company money he created a totally secure communications system, installing military-grade crystals in their radios so they could transmit on protected channels. In Maine, he was stationed at the Communication House, 110 miles from Machias in Skowgan, to operate the 60-foot antenna they'd installed to stay in touch with the ship. A lot of juice ran to that 5,000-watt tower. When you turned it on, the lights would dim, the room would hum, and you'd get warm standing next to it, waiting for word to come that the mother ship, codenamed Cowboy, was nearing Little Machias Bay. Cowboy finally arrived in October, negotiating Maine's difficult inlets at night, guided by the two main towers of the Navy's Submarine Communications Center, just across Little Machias Bay. The crew motored the Zodiacs out to meet the ship in Smuggler's Blackout, beneath a moonless sky. They dropped chem lights in milk bottles as buoys to mark the way back. The man in the bow of each Zodiac held up a piece of aluminum so the mothership could pick them up on radar. The crews wore thick black wetsuits. The Zodiac pilots had hockey helmets rigged with radio headsets. They looked ridiculous with 6-inch antennae sticking up from their heads, but that's what Harlan improvised so they could work hands-free. From the beach, Dave monitored their progress with a Starlight night vision scope he'd seen in the pages of Soldier of Fortune. The operation went off without a hitch. After traveling 10,000 miles, the tie stick breezed through the final stretch, from the boat to the beach and up the cliff. It was another flawless operation. And it felt great. While the load was being sorted in the equipment house, Ed brought the investors in for inspection. The equipment was packed and stored, and the stash was loaded into a Dodge van. A company detachment, all of them dressed in deliveryman's dickies, drove down the eastern seaboard. The van and a chase car a mile apart, dropping off boxes marked generators in the wee hours. It was $20 million worth of product in all. It seemed just right when Steve Miller came on the van's radio one night, singing "Take the Money and Run." In a suite at the Waldorf Astoria, the partners divided the spoils. One of the investors, Bruce Tanaka, had a lead on some Mercedes 450 Cell 6.9s, which were semi-street legal and had to be imported from Europe via an underground dealer. Tanaka was taking orders. As a reward for a job well done, Lou and Ed each bought one of the luxury sedans, in complementary colors. The victory celebration, as usual, was epic. In an age of excess, the idealism of the 60s had long since given way to the indulgence of the 70s. The company could afford to be more excessive than most. "Why settle for a glass of champagne," Lou would say, "when you can have a Magnum?" It was vivid living, surrounded by friends, seeing your champagne flute filled as soon as it was empty, unless you followed Pop's lead, draining your glass and throwing it into the fireplace. Toasting big, stumbling out to the limos at dawn with a girl on your arm. It felt like you were going to live forever. It's what Ed meant when he and Al stood looking out at the ocean one day, toward ports east, and he said, "You know what? It's just freeway all the way." Heat. 1978. Lou was on the slopes in Vail, Colorado, when he learned about the indictment, 8 counts in San Diego's district court, naming him, Ed, Lance, Bob, and 22 others. The D's Operation CORCO had convinced the grand jury. The indictment hadn't been unsealed yet, but Phil DeMasa's office had gotten wind of it early. "The bloom is off the rose," DeMasa said, after a call came in from his office. Lou frowned, planted his poles, and kept skiing. Lou figured that if the authorities knew where they were, they'd have been arrested already. He was right. The DEA had no leads on company members' whereabouts, and the agents in San Diego lacked the resources to go after fugitives, especially if those fugitives had deep pockets. The agency could gin up indictments, but it lacked what agents called habeas corpus, the capacity to make big arrests. Lou and Dave arranged to meet DeMasa at the Mark Hopkins Hotel in San Francisco. As DeMasa walked down Sutter Street, they watched from the 8th floor through binoculars to make sure he wasn't being followed, then led him through a back entrance into the hotel. "As your attorney, I advise you to turn yourself in," DeMasa said once they were safely in the room. Then he grinned. "Now, with that out of the way, let's get down to business." Using carefully worded hypotheticals, DeMasa briefed the company on how to survive as fugitives. He told them to protect their cash and documents in sealed envelopes addressed to him, so they would be shielded by attorney-client privilege and could be opened only with a warrant. He parsed the charges, the felonies, and misdemeanors. The three of them agreed that the principals should stay on the run and that some others might surrender and strategically cooperate so as to get light sentences but not give up the goods. This was a new idea, doing time for the company. But things were different now, more complicated. Lou would have to turn on the coach charm and tell his team that sacrifice was necessary. The rest of the indictees would show up in court, en masse, on the day the indictment was unsealed. "We can get slaps on the wrist for the underlings," DeMasa promised. Then he told Lou that he'd spent his latest $300,000 payment already. Lou sent him on his way with another $50,000 in cash. Hiding in plain sight, the company's principals went further upscale, relocating to Santa Barbara. Bob, who was already hanging out with his Brotherhood of Eternal Love friends up there, moved into a huge Spanish-style hacienda. Out back was a tennis court, where he and Lou would have fierce 5-hour matches. Ed bought a house near Bob, and both of them took up polo, stabling 20 ponies apiece at the Santa Barbara Polo and Racket Club. Ed wasn't great at the game, still the bull in the china shop, but Bob had real finesse. Lou thought he looked beautiful in the saddle. Bob's friends called him Light Sholahadni on account of his love of the glamorous life, and he was living up to his nickname in Santa Barbara. People took notice of his good looks and smile. He was Kennedy-esque, they thought, like a 70s style, feel-good Bobby. Maybe that was what the members of the local Chamber of Commerce were thinking when they asked him to run for a newly opened state assembly seat. He politely declined a wise decision for a drug smuggler living under a false name. On his visits to Santa Barbara, DeMassa protested half-heartedly about all the public revelry. But the truth was that he was fond of Bob and Ed and liked going to those parties, too. All of them did. Still, it was a dangerous game, being that high profile. Ed was probably the most conspicuous. He couldn't reinvent himself as a patrician the way Bob and Lou had. The more money he had, the more he looked like a criminal. It was a matter of style. The company guys all called Ed the Kid, because he called everyone else kid, as in, hey, kid, how about some more wine over here? The kind of demeanor that got plenty of second looks at the polo club. In many ways, Ed was in fact a big kid, always looking for fun and excitement, and when Lou gave him a Ferrari one Christmas, surprising Ed by leading him, eyes closed, to a baby blue convertible with a big red bow on it, Ed smiled and said, "Damn, kid. You shouldn't have." Now Lou agreed that he probably shouldn't have, watching Ed clock 100 miles per hour down Shoreline Drive or pull drunk donuts in the parking lot of Santa Barbara's ritziest joint, appropriately called Talk of the Town. But Ed earned his keep. He ran point on the Thai supply chain, which Lou considered a lion's den. It was Ed who traveled overseas, connecting with growers, cutting out the middlemen and increasing the company's profits, the kind of profits that made it possible to throw money at DeMassa, hold the feds at bay, and keep the company machine running smoothly, moving product, while the partners played with their ponies. The bigger problem for the company partners was not in Santa Barbara at all. Lance claimed that it was his decision to leave the company. The other partners were under the impression that they'd fired him. He had become too much of a liability, they thought. His showboating had gotten out of control. He may have cut his hair short, but he was still the same old Lance, standing out rather than blending in, opening suitcases full of money wherever he went. Lance's other nickname was Ensign Hero, the Navy washout who thought he was invincible. In Tahoe, after the indictment came down and they were all on the lam, Lance would be out on the lake, testing the high-powered cigarette boats he'd built, getting yelled at over a police helicopter loudspeaker for speeding. The real trouble with Lance was his leaking. "We know you're talking to Paul Acree," Ed told Lance one day. Lou remembered the day Lance showed up on his bike, like some kind of stoned angel, asking him to get off the ladder and go to Mexico. There would be no company if not for Lance, he knew. But now he and Bob and Ed had no choice but to buy him out. They eventually settled on an exit package of $400,000. In the spring of 1978, DeMassa met Lance in the parking structure of the Orange County Courthouse, where they chatted briefly. "Stay out of trouble," DeMassa told him. As he was leaving, he pointed to a briefcase he'd set between them. "Oh," he said, "I think this is yours." When he opened the briefcase, Lance felt jilted. It contained $180,000, half the agreed amount, less DeMassa's transaction fee. Part of the reason everyone moved to Santa Barbara was to ditch Lance. But Lance wouldn't go away that easily. He had more to lose than Paul. He was named in the indictment along with everyone else. He was a fugitive like them, but he was on his own. Out in the cold, his only value to anyone was what he knew. Lost at sea. 1978. Success, Dave knew, was a fragile thing. So many parts of a smuggling operation could go wrong, it was necessary to have not just a plan B but also a plan C and a plan D. Still, even the best risk manager could never make the risk go away entirely. The first sign of trouble with the latest gig occurred right at the beginning, when Danny Tuna, after being contracted by the company to bring 5 tons of hash back from Pakistan, vanished. Danny was a drinker, and he'd gone on a bender and disappeared. Enter Plan B. Ed flew to Singapore, bought a 130-foot boat called the Tusker, under the auspices of a shell company called Ocean Survey and Studies, Limited, based, naturally, in Beverly Hills, and hired a new captain, Jerry Samsel. The company had never worked with Samsel before. None of the members of his crew were regulars. And not long after the Tusker left Pakistan bound for Maine, they stopped hearing from him. Back in Maine, Al Sweeney listened for the Tusker during their radio appointments but heard nothing but static. Dave was confused. He had supplied the Tusker's crew with the usual coded Mylar charts to give encrypted positions and provided them with several radio systems, single sideband, VHF, UHF, and CB. What Dave didn't know was that Samsel had turned paranoid and ordered a total radio blackout. This was in September. The Tusker wasn't due for 10 weeks. All the company could do was wait. Tensions were high. Fuzzy and Harlan were at each other's throats. Dave was so frantic one night that Fuzzy slipped opium into his joint to calm him down. And quiet, shy Al was coming undone, getting edgier each day and claiming that he could hear messages from the missing ship coming through the static. Then, one day in October, the feds appeared. Dave saw them first. Andy, a new hired hand, had picked him up at the airport in Bangor, Maine, and they were driving to the house atop the cliff in Machias when a man sitting in a car by the side of the road did a double take, flipped a U-turn, and started following them. One of the neighbors, it turned out, was a retired cop, and he had grown suspicious about the house's occupants. He reported the address to the police, who suspected smuggling and contacted the DEA. A title check revealed a mysterious buyer whose only listed address was a P.O. box in Boston. The DEA didn't know they had stumbled on the Coronado Company fugitives from California. But local agents had been mobilized, and now they were behind Dave and Andy. Dave took a deep breath and stepped on the gas. The truck Dave was driving happened to be one that Fuzzy had enhanced with lift kits for ground clearance and a down and dirty switch that turned off the brake lights and head and tail lights, a feature that came in handy for evasive driving in the backwoods of Maine. At one hairpin turn, Dave slowed, told Andy to take the wheel, jumped out of the truck, and rolled into the woods. The agents sped past. Dave hiked for 9 miles to a payphone, where he called for Fuzzy to pick him up. Andy was arrested, the company's first casualty in action. Dave made it back to the equipment house near Freedom, which remained safe. But the Tusker silence had now become a much more serious problem. The company house was made and the boat, oblivious and somewhere out on the ocean, was headed right for it. "Listen, listen," Al kept saying, handing Dave the radio headset. "They're talking to us." Dave heard only squelching, but Al was writing down positions. Fuzzy thought he was going batty. Yet Al was so convinced that sometimes Dave thought he could hear voices, too, off in the distance. Someone was saying something, but you couldn't understand what. It was spooky, watching Al every night, listening intently, eyes closed, recording the advance of a ghost ship. Al's wireless seances didn't convince Ed, who decided on a daring plan C. He would go find the Tusker himself, from the sky. He traveled to South Africa, chartered a plane, and began flying a grid pattern over the Atlantic to intercept the Tusker before she steamed into a trap. He spent hours over the ocean, passing back and forth and scanning the surface, ready with a series of messages he'd drop to the ship if he spotted her. It was a desperate measure, but if he could direct the Tusker to an alternate site, disaster would be averted. The plane never spotted the Tusker, because the boat was already north of Ed's search area. The miscalculation was not Ed's fault. Dave had told the ship's captain he should under no circumstances arrive before Christmas, but Samsel had ignored him and was, in fact, making great time. The Tusker appeared in Little Machias Bay 2 weeks early, anchored in the private cove by the house, and sent a party ashore. Samsel had left his antenna up in the weather and it had frozen off. Now that he wanted to break radio silence, he couldn't. 2 crew members knocked on the company house door and were confused when no one answered. The feds were on alert when Dave mobilized Harlan and another hired hand, nicknamed Rabbit, for Plan D, an amphibious intercept. Harlan and Rabbit fired up a Zodiac and approached the cove from the sea. There was the Tusker, a sitting duck, just 50 yards offshore. Harlan radioed an emergency call to Dave, boarded the Tusker, and told the captain to make a break for it. As he and Rabbit sped away in the Zodiac, Harlan could see the blue lights of the Coast Guard boats behind them. Harlan beached the Zodiac, and he and Rabbit scrambled ashore. They grabbed their emergency kits, which were issued to every company employee, backpacks stocked with a compass, rations, matches, gloves, some pemmican beef jerky, and other supplies. What they needed now were the burlap leggings. They had been furnished at the suggestion of a wilderness expert and tracker who worked for the company out west. "If there's a manhunt," he'd said, "the police will have dogs, and burlap on your legs will hide the scent." Harlan sat down on the beach, pulled on 2 burlap sacks, and ran into the forest. When Dave stopped hearing from Harlan, he radioed the equipment house, where Fuzzy answered. Dave then sent Fuzzy and another scout to the house, a classic tactical mistake in the fog of war. On their second visit,